Emma, good afternoon. How are you? Chris dialed her husband Aiden's number. Aidan, I'd like to see you. Could you come and visit us this weekend? Chris, I can't, the woman said with a sigh. We have one problem after another. My husband's sick and Lexi's alone with the kids. I can't leave her. Okay. I wish your husband a speedy recovery. Chris stood in the kitchen looking out the window. She remembered how 3 years ago Emma had sobbed at her husband's birthday party, shedding floods of tears that she desperately needed a car. Her husband had left her. Her poor daughter couldn't handle anything on her own. Aiden then gave her a lot of Kalina. Neither Emma nor her daughter were thrilled about it. Probably dreamed of getting Alexis, huh? The nephew was angry then. As time went on, they still had no conscience. The car wasn't Aiden's only gift. The fact was that her husband Chris and his younger brother had inherited the car, as she liked to say. But that wasn't really the case. When the boy's parents died, they were old enough. Aiden was 17 years old and Kieran was 14. For a year, the aunt took custody. But when the older boy came of age, he looked after Kieran on his own. If it hadn't been for me, Emma liked to say, there's no telling how you'd have ended up. In fact, the aunt did nothing for them. Aiden was a man of his word. He started working part-time right out of high school. After graduating, he went to college. He and Kieran were paid a small pension for the loss of their parents, so the boys did pretty well for themselves. They were not seen neither in drunken companies, nor in nightclubs, except that when Kieran grew up, he wasn't what Aiden had envisioned him to be. But at all events, at every opportunity and inconvenience, Emma always put herself on display. Her boys, as she called her nephews in public, had only grown up that way because of her. How much Emma had invested in them. Auntie had never expected Aiden to want a good life. The boy was very determined. He worked hard, and when he had his first success, Emma showed up. In the end, according to the conversation she had with her husband and his wife Krish, she found out that Aiden's aunt had gotten a nice house from him, a car for her daughter Maggie, and a summer house for her sick husband, except that no one knew why the latter wanted it. Chris sighed. Emma had visited her husband several times in the beginning of his illness, but time passed and he was quickly forgotten. They had also forgotten that they lived in a well-appointed house he'd bought at his expense, that Lexi drove a car given to her by Aiden. The woman realized that Emma had her own opinions on the matter. It seemed to her that her favorite nephew owed her for giving him and his brother such a good upbringing. How beautifully she spoke when she came to visit. Chris sighed, a pittance for all her words. She reflected. She genuinely loved her husband. Chris had already recovered a bit from the news that he was going to die soon. The only thing she wanted to do then was to do anything for him, so that he would experience joy in the last days of his life. Aiden had given up too much to become an independent man. His business had taken away his most precious possession, first his health, and now it was taking away his life. While still a student, he got a job at a cement factory. Then he became a foreman and rose to deputy director. But very serious problems arose at the enterprise. The plant went bankrupt through the fault of the director, and then Aiden and another man bought it out and tried to restart it. They succeeded. Eventually, the co-owner sold his share to Chris's husband. Aiden met his wife when he was already 35 years old. By then, he had a lot of ailments. He did not hide from his girlfriend that he was infertile. The factory took away from him any possibility of having an heir. The man immediately informed the girl about it. She was not very upset. Chris fell in love with Aiden at first sight. One day, she came with her boss to the factory to help him formalize the deal. Their company was small, so the girl often had to fulfill the role of manager. After 6 months of acquaintance, Aiden and Chris got married. The girl was not particularly attracted to his wealth. The man, as it seemed to her at first sight, was first of all a good friend and companion. Her husband never insisted on Chris working somewhere. She worked for a couple more years and then focused all her attention on the house. And the house was big. Her wife liked to run the household, help the cook in the kitchen, and generally do household chores. But when Aiden got sick, Chris focused on him. For the first few months, she struggled. She thought it couldn't happen. But the doctors warned her that it was a diagnosis she couldn't live with for long. She traveled to Washington with Aiden, but they said the same thing. You can go to the moon, they told her then. But unfortunately, they haven't found a cure there yet either. Then Chris had a period when she traveled to monasteries, standing through hours-long services. The woman decided to turn to God for help, but one day she had a dream. It will be better for him if he leaves now, some old woman told her in her dream. Believe me, that is the greatest good for him. After that, Chris calmed down. She accepted that Aiden had to go. She clearly realized that she didn't really know the real reason for what was happening to him. It wasn't given to her to know. Chris was very upset by Emma's refusal to stop by Aiden's house. This meeting would probably be their last. Okay, she sighed. I'll try David's luck, and she dialed her husband's brother's number. Oh, Chris. I can't right now at all, he answered. Sandy needs to be taken to her mother's. She broke her leg, she can't walk. David, Aiden really asked you to come over. She tried one last time, but it didn't work. Chris sat down tiredly in her chair and covered her face with her hands. She was in a lot of pain from the indifference of the people Aiden considered his closest to him. Maybe we should stop lying. She wiped away her tears and walked over to her husband. After all, they've always been like this. Why did Aiden's fatal illness make them have to change? Chris opened the door absently. Her husband lay with his eyes closed. She walked over and touched his arm. He immediately came to his senses. "Honey," she called softly, "none of them can come. I'm so sorry." Her husband was silent. He was thinking about something. Then a smile shone on his face. It turned out just as he had intended. "Chrissy," said slowly, "I did it on purpose. I knew this is exactly what would happen. You could say I gave them one last chance, but they didn't take it." Chris stroked his hair. Tears streamed down her cheeks. No matter how much she held herself together, she couldn't be a robot. "I left a will. It will be read in exactly 1 month by my lawyer," Aiden pronounced. "Don't worry, you'll get everything, but I want to surprise them." Chris didn't bother to contradict him. At the time, she hadn't even thought about what she would do with all the money she would get from the factory that Aiden had sold a year ago. 2 weeks passed. None of the relatives showed up. Aiden asked to have a lawyer come to see him. He had left a will a long time ago, but he wanted to make sure it would be like this again. The man felt he didn't have much time left. 3 days after that, Chris's husband died. She was deeply saddened, but she pulled herself together and started calling everyone on Aiden's list. In addition to relatives, former employees, and friends, all the neighbors and acquaintances of Aiden's parents were to come. The farewell was going to be massive. Chris turned her attention to Emma and her daughter. Both were constantly sobbing and wiping away tears. To the widow, it all seemed contrived. "Oh, Chris, what grief. Aiden's aunt hung on her. What will we do without him now?" Chris wanted very much to tell her what she thought of her, but she didn't throw a tantrum. Kieran was on the phone the whole time. He had the impression that this was all routine for him. He didn't even realize that he would never have Aiden in his life again. The memorial dinner was coming to an end. People came up to Chris now and then, thanking her, offering condolences again. Emma came up as well. "The last time I talked to Aiden, he said he was going to be making a will." "I'll call you," Chris replied coldly. "It's going to be read in a month by Aiden's lawyer." Kieran didn't forget to approach her either. He was, as always, annoying. His phone was ringing now and again. "Chris, what about the will?" "Forehead," he asked. "I know he just wanted to leave me some money." Chris looked at him and marveled at his audacity. Not only had Kieran been completely on Aiden's provision until he was 20, but his older brother had given him everything, right down to the car, put money into his account. But Kieran turned out to be inherently ungrateful. When Aiden finally realized this, they had a huge row. "You'll never get another dime from me," shouted the older brother at the time. "Do you want it? Go work at the factory. Don't count on me anymore." Kieran wanted to shame him, but then he couldn't help himself and sent Aiden away. For years they hadn't spoken, but the younger brother Kieran realized what he might have lost. So before Aiden's illness, he started to impose on him again. The latter realized what was going on, but he didn't push him away. He had played with him all his life, so it was his turn. But as it turned out, during his illness, Kieran had been to him only a couple of times, and that, you could say, in passing. The man kept complaining that he didn't have enough time for anything. Kieran saw himself as a real businessman. In fact, the whole essence of his work was to buy somewhere cheaper and then sell it more expensive. Kieran was married with 2 children, but he was used to living a free life. Chris and Aiden never interfered with his family, but here and there they heard rumors that Kieran had been seen with a mistress or in bad company. He liked to live large. It is worth noting that Aiden did not attend his wedding because he was in a quarrel with his brother at the time. But he transferred a very large sum of money to Kieran as a wedding gift. However, he wasn't even thanked for it. Chris returned home. Everything was empty and gray. No matter how much you prepare for tragedy, when it comes, you can't find a place to be. That was the case with her. A week passed, and Chris tried to distract herself a little with chores at home. The only thing she didn't want to do then was to see Aiden's relatives again, or to get involved in the whole thing at all. She'd had enough of the house she'd been left by her husband, but his in-laws had their own plans for it. "Lexi, let's figure out what we're going to get, shall we?" her mother said to her daughter one night. "His entire estate will be split 3 ways. Us, Kieran, and Chris. But money-wise, there'll probably be $1 million in there." Lexi said dreamily. "Oh, and if we sell the house and his expensive car, that should all be split equally." Emma nodded contentedly. She really liked their future prospects. She closed her eyes in pleasure. At first she saw herself at an expensive resort, but then she changed her mind. A huge 2-story house with servants grew before her eyes. It was the kind of place she deserved. With incredible labor, Emma drove her husband, who couldn't stand it, and left her with her daughter Lexi. Then she put him on child support. Pretty soon she realized that wasn't enough, so she started dropping by to visit her younger sister Emily, who was doing quite well in life. Emily, Aiden and Kieran's mother, helped her all the time. All in all, Emma, with little effort, was living a good life. The woman didn't work anywhere until Lexi was 12 years old. Emily and her husband waited a long time for Emma to wake up to her conscience. But alas, her husband Joshua had to tell her everything, No more in your house until I get home, she shouted at the top of her voice. What have you done for Lexi and me? A piece of bread. After that, Emily never spoke to her sister again, and if it hadn't been for the death of their parents, Aidan and Kieran wouldn't have known that their aunt could take them in, or rather, they would have stayed at her place, and she would have been their guardian. Oh, how much dirt she had poured on her sister. Almost every time she visited the boys, she brainwashed them. Aidan never believed it. Kieran, on the other hand, was interested in collecting gossip. He was friends with his aunt, but not to the point where he couldn't do without her. But they were worth each other. Lexi was making plans for her cousin's money, too. She was sure her mother would give her half. The woman repeated exactly the same fate as her. Lexi got together with one man, bore him 2 children, and then safely kicked him out with child support. Winning, she returned home to her mother Emma's house, leaving her rented apartment behind. Lexi wasn't the type to go crazy over work either. She worked on an ad hoc basis. All the more reason she needed to get her personal life together. She was only going to marry a rich man, and while he was looking for her, the woman was willing to settle for simpler lovers. The blood was boiling in Kieran's veins. Somehow he was sure that Aunt Emma would get a small share. He and Chris would share the cream of the crop. The man had long wanted an expensive car, and in general in his dreams was to buy a nightclub. That's where the money flowed. Everything was possible there, if you agree with the roof. And for the latter, Kieran had a very good tongue. So right after Aidan's death, his kin had already pocketed all his property. But all this was only in their dreams. 3 days before the appointed date, Chris called Emma and Kieran and asked them to come to the lawyer's office. The latter had asked her to do so. He didn't give a reason why they couldn't meet at her house. However, it didn't matter to Chris. That day, Chris became with a very bad premonition. Her heart was beating faster than usual. Something is going to happen, she whispered. I can't wait for this probate thing to be over. She made no effort to dress up and tied a black handkerchief and some powder on her head. Her face was very pale. Kieran was already standing beside the lawyer. He was very pleased. 5 minutes later, a car stopped near them and Emma and Lexi got out. Everyone was happy, smiling. The lawyer invited the guests to his place, waited until everyone was seated. Emma and Kieran kept looking over at each other. Well, may we begin? The lawyer said solemnly. So, I will now read Aidan's will to you. Everyone sat there, holding their breath. Chris was the only one who didn't care. She was very uncomfortable being in the same company with all these people. She had no complaints about the lawyer. I'll start with Emma and her daughter Lexi. The lawyer looked at the women. Per your nephew and cousin's request, you are to inherit a bicycle. Emma's eyes darkened at those words, and the office went completely silent. She could not see clearly what the matter was, and looked intently at the lawyer. That's all, calmly he replied and handed her a copy of the will. What are you swearing about? You are lying. There can be no such thing. I cured him with my own hands. He couldn't do this to me. Emma and Lexi nearly trashed the entire office. The man had to call security and escort them outside. Kieran sat neither alive nor dead. The lawyer looked at him and continued reading the will. Kieran inherits Aidan's first car. Moscovich 2137, he announced. What the hell are you talking about? Kieran jumped up from his chair. What's this all about? I'm his own brother. I think I've figured it out. Chris paid you to tamper with the will. I'm going to sue you. Please calm down, the lawyer pronounced. Aidan had prepared all the necessary documents for this case. He knew before he died that this was what would happen. Kieran ran out of the office. He saw the aunt and her daughter still standing outside. He went up to them and began to hatefully tell them what had gotten to him. They were all very loudly indignant. Finally, Chris came out of the building. Everyone immediately rushed over to her. Everyone wanted to make a point. Oh, you, Emma addressed her, decided to take everything for yourself. But I'll show you now. And she tried to claw into Chris's hair. At the scream, a security guard ran out and dragged the crazy aunt away. The lawyer came out to them as well. So, here's how it is, he coldly addressed the particularly furious. I am now making a report and have called the police. Are you threatening an innocent man? To top it all off, I'll be defending Chris in court. You have a group threat on a person's life, he said loudly, so I can put you all in jail. Do you understand me? Emma and her daughter Lexi headed off to the side. Kieran remained silent. As much as he wanted to strangle his brother Aidan's wife with his own hands, it was dangerous. Everyone gave Chris an unkind look as she drove away in her car. Something has to be done. Aunt Emma ran up to her nephew. Kiryusha, we can't leave it all like this. She forced Aidan to deprive us of our share, the bitch. I gave so much effort to raise you, and now I'm left with nothing. I'll call you later, Kieran said grudgingly. Come on, I have to go to a lawyer. I'll get back to you as soon as I'm done. He jumped into the car and drove off. Emma and Lexi stood there stunned. This was not the outcome they had expected. How are we supposed to live now? Emma howled. Can you believe she robbed us of everything? Lexi didn't answer her. Her jaw went back and forth in anger. All her dreams of a good life had been shattered in an instant. I hate it. She clenched her fists, both of them. She couldn't stop cursing. Still, there was nothing that could be done that day. but both were determined to fight to the end. Kieran stopped outside an office building. He had a friend working there. The man simply flew up to the second floor. Quickly, he told him what the nature of the case was. "It's hard to say," the man replied, "only to sue. That way there is at least a minimal chance." Kieran was not ready to spend money on a lawyer or a court. He was a rather greedy man, and extra expenses annoyed him. "Bastard," he cursed at Aiden. "Bastard." He threatened Chris. "You think I won't deal with you?" Chris was lucky. Aiden's lawyer did everything for her, so she didn't even show up in court. The arguments he provided were enough, and Chris won the case. But Kieran didn't stop there. He filed more and more lawsuits. Almost a year went by, but nothing changed. "Oh my God, what the hell is this?" Kieran shouted in anger. "I have thrown so much money into the wind, and all without results. Who's going to make it up to me?" One day, when he was in a bad mood, he went to visit his Aunt Emma. She was still living in hope. "There's nothing we can do," he sighed. "That bitch is going to spend Aiden's money left and right. I hate her. I'm sure she's the one who put him up to disinheriting us." Emma's eyes widened. They sat in silence. All three of them felt heavy. Lexi came home with a new boyfriend. The woman wasn't particularly choosy, and now her suitor was a beau who'd done time for stealing. "Hi," Kieran shook the man's hand. "Lexi's guest. She's told me a lot about you." "Joe, so how are you doing?" Kieran was a little embarrassed. As it turned out, his cousin couldn't keep her mouth shut. She told her new lover everything. "Listen, Kiryusha," Joshua told him brotherly, "well, I think that your problem is easily solved. It just needs to be removed." "Then that's it." Kieran looked at him contemptuously. He immediately shook his head negatively. "No, I don't get involved in dirty deeds. Thank you for the offer, but it's a waste to sigh for nothing. We could organize everything in such a way that there would be no trace of her," Joshua persisted. "We should catch her and make her sign all the papers for you, or drown her. That way you'd have everything, and Lexi and her mom too." Kieran didn't want to hear any of this nonsense. He said goodbye to his relatives and left immediately. "Fool," Joe scratched his head. "I can give him such guys that no police will ever find them." Kieran quickly forgot the conversation with his new acquaintance. He continued to fight in court, but after 3 months he realized that he was completely exhausted. "What can I do with her? Kieran was going crazy. I'll soon be completely out of money because of her." For several days he was not himself. Kieran knew he should back off, but he couldn't. Maybe he should really order her murder. A thought flashed through his head. It was such a huge amount of money. It would be worth it. So Kieran took the risk. He went back to Aunt Emma's house to talk to Joshua. The latter was very pleased with his decision. "But I have one condition," he smiled oddly. "We'll split the inheritance in half for you, half for us." "What's in it for you? Half?" Kieran jumped to attention. "He is my brother, and you are his distant relatives." "But it's up to you," Joe replied calmly. "I won't work on any other terms." Kieran left again with nothing. He was strangled by a toad. He didn't want to give up half of it to some hustlers because of his brainless aunt. But the very idea of getting rid of Chris now seemed the only right thing to do. "Maybe I can hire other people," he reasoned. "That way I can save money." So Kieran tried to find such people through his connections, but the cost was not insignificant either. Plus, no one gave a guarantee that those people wouldn't pawn him off later. Lexi's boyfriend was interested in getting the money, and in her, so he seemed more reliable in this situation. For almost a week, Kieran weighed the pros and cons. Finally, he realized that it was better to have half of Aiden's brother's property in this situation than nothing at all. So he went to see Joshua again. "But I see you made the right choice," Lexi's suitor was choosing the right words. "Well, I'm very happy for you. With this approach, we can now discuss all the details." The men retired to a separate room. Joshua didn't want to reveal all the details to Lexi and her mother Emma. "This is a man's business," he told them sternly, "so please stay out of our way for half an hour." Kieran was also an inherently devious man. He had screwed over a lot of people for small amounts of money, but still. "I do all the dirty work," Joe said. "I've got people I've checked out, but remember, you give your word. So once you get your money, half of it will be mine, and I'll take care of Lexi and Emma myself. Besides, they don't need to know about anything." "I agree," Kieran shook his hand. "We need to meet somewhere and talk about this ourselves." Lexi and her mother eavesdropped at the door, but the men were talking so quietly they couldn't make out anything. The floor creaked and the hostesses barely had time to bounce off the door and ran straight into the kitchen. Kieran left, and Lexi and her mother began to pester the suitor. The man had his own plans for his life. Lexi was his temporary refuge, especially since Joe was a man who knew life. He knew how to get everyone wrapped around his finger. "I'm afraid it's not going to work out," he sighed. First he agreed, and then he chickened out, a weakling. "So what? We're going to be out of money now," Emma sobbed. "But why is everything so unfair?" "Mom," Joshua said in a friendly voice, "well, you have me, and I can make a living for you. Believe me, Joe, I have a treasure trove." Lexi came up to him and hugged him. "I'm like a wall of stone with him." The man kissed her passionately and asked her to organize lunch. After 2, he had work to do. Emma decided not to call Kieran again. All her hopes were dashed. She was left with nothing. I'll beg him for money from time to time, she decided. He has no one left but me, and I'm old, so let him give me money for my medicine. Kieran drove in the car and thought about whether he had done the right thing. No, he didn't feel sorry for Chris. It was the amount of money that some Joe out there could get out of his money that choked him. All right, so be it, he said to himself. Otherwise I'll be left with nothing for sure, and Chris will spend it all. 3 days later, they met Joshua at the cafe. He was smiling. So, well, I'm all set, he said. I found the guys, and the rest when we go out. Kieran paid for the coffee, and they got into his car. Joe explained his ingenious plan. You don't take it home. It's dangerous, he explained. There might be cameras, or the alarm system might go off somewhere. Her abduction would have to be spontaneous. Where? Kieran was wary. She doesn't go to church. Chris stays at home most of the time. But that's for my man to find out, Joshua replied. It'll probably take a week, once we have a rough idea of how she lives. Then we'll track her down for kidnapping. And then what? Kieran, are you going to kill her right away? He didn't want to have this conversation. No, we just need to make her disappear. The bandit smiled. She had a tragedy, so she couldn't take it. Maybe she decided to drown herself in the river. Maybe she committed suicide. Maybe she went into the woods and went crazy there. There's a lot of scenarios. We'll play the one that fits her situation best. The important thing is that she's not found a year from now. Then that's it. The man is reported missing, and we can start your inheritance case. Yeah, it's a long time, Kieran sighed. I thought we could do it in a couple of months. How much longer will we have to wait? But you don't want a shadow on you, do you? That's why we have to wait. There's no other option, Joe agreed. They agreed to keep in touch, to discuss everything that was going on in person, which would be every 3 days. And again, Kieran had his doubts. Waiting another year was not in his plans. He wanted to get everything at once. Especially the money he had spent on the courts had not fallen from the sky. All right, the main thing is that they remove it. And then there is nothing to worry about, he thought. Kieran began to actively find out what would happen if his only brother's wife died. He wanted to understand all the legalities beforehand. Joshua realized that the case was very lucrative. That kind of money would give him a very good future. And since he was already in prison, he wasn't afraid to do such things. Besides, he wouldn't be the one to kill this woman. There was a man he owed a debt to. He was from their circle, too. He was in jail for murder. He agreed right away. It wouldn't have been hard to take care of the woman. Giving Joe $2 million was a problem, so they made an easy deal. The same man offered his buddy as a partner for a little money. He agreed to participate. Well, it's a done deal, I guess you could say, Joshua said to himself. The main thing is to keep Kieran on the hook. He's a tricky one. Chris, even though she wasn't involved in the court case, was tired of it all. Kieran wouldn't leave her alone. He'd come to see her several times, confronted her, demanded that she give him his share. It was Aiden's decision, she told him. I didn't know until the will was read that it would contain lies. He was cursing in the front yard because Chris wouldn't let him in the house. Did you make him do it? Are you determined to steal from all of us? I know for a fact that you never loved Aiden. Do you have a lover? Chris realized that all this talk was pointless, so she blocked Kieran's number and didn't go out when he visited her. She was in a lot of pain from losing her husband, but his brother didn't care. He was only interested in the property. I have to get on with my life somehow, she thought. I don't want to sit in one place all the time, Chris thought. I'm sure I'll go crazy that way. She had been thinking about what she wanted to do for months now. She was still young. She was going to turn 30 in September, so it was too early to bury herself at that age. What do I want? Chris reasoned. With this kind of money, I could set up some kind of business, but what could it be? No thoughts had yet entered her head. At first she decided to go somewhere to rest, but changed her mind. She felt more at ease at home. Besides, she clearly felt that she could safely adopt a child here. One evening a thought occurred to her. So I could devote myself to him. But the woman felt that her life would change dramatically. She might even get married. No, Chris cut those thoughts off at once. I love Aiden. He's my whole life. I'll be faithful to him to the end. Everything in the house reminded her of him. Maybe that was why she didn't want to leave it, even for a couple days. It was like Aiden was right there with her. He was present. The widow was very afraid of losing that sense of connection with him. Still, the woman needed to get out of the house from time to time. It had been a long time since Chris had driven a car. She drove her own, again in memory of Aiden. The wife didn't touch his car or his things. She went to the store. All her thoughts revolved around her husband. I didn't ask for much. Tears ran down her cheeks. Why did they take him away from me? The shopping had been uneventful too. There were 3 people working in Aiden's house, but sometimes Chris let them go. She wanted to be completely alone. She put the shopping in the trunk and headed back home. Chris was not a fan of beauty salons or expensive boutiques. In general, despite her husband's money, Chris had always lived modestly. She could not find expensive jewelry, brand-name bags. In her closet hung a few sets of clothes for each season and 2 dresses for the holiday. That was it for now. Chris felt like someone was about to cut her off. She flinched and came to her senses. Someone drove past her sharply. Some kind of black Jeep. "You gotta be more careful," the woman said to herself, "or I'll end up going to the next world because of my absent-mindedness." Perhaps that's what she wanted then. At that point in her life, Chris really didn't want to live. It had lost its meaning with Aiden gone. So another couple weeks passed, but the woman still hadn't come up with anything. She wanted to change something, but she didn't understand how to do it. Kieran was no longer stalking her, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Chris didn't get out of the house much these days, but that day she felt like going for a walk. She drove to a crowded place. She needed to be around people. The woman left the car in the parking lot near the main square, but she didn't want to stay there for long. So Chris decided to walk forward through the small streets. She must have been walking for about an hour. Chris felt thirsty and headed towards a small cafe she saw on the corner. She entered it and sat at a table for a while, drank some water, and looked out the window without much interest. There were poems and voices being heard in the cafe, but they did not attract her attention. "You gotta get home," she said to herself, and got up from the table. Someone held the door for her. She didn't even notice, automatically thanked, and looked around. Chris headed in the direction of the alley she came here. Suddenly someone behind her came up behind her and brought a hand up to her face. Everything swirled in front of her eyes. "Hey," she heard before she lost consciousness and fell to the pavement. "Are you okay?" She felt a slap on her face. "Can you hear me?" A man's voice came to Chris. She opened her eyes. Her head hurt badly. Chris tried to turn it, but she felt very dizzy and a throbbing in her left temple. "What's wrong?" She could barely utter the words. "Who are you?" "I can't remember," the stranger shrugged. "We left the cafe together. My phone rang, and I was walking behind you. Suddenly some black car stopped and someone attacked you from behind. They had already dragged you into the car. When I caught up with them, it was a bit of a fight." "Did you see their faces?" Chris asked me right away. "No, they were wearing masks," the man answered. "It's just that when I gave one, he quickly jumped into the car and they drove off. The driver wasn't wearing a mask, but I didn't get a good look at him." "What did they want from me?" the woman said in horror. "If they wanted to rob me, why didn't they take my bag?" "I think it was you. They wanted to steal the stranger's side. Where do you live? Let me give you a ride." If they did it on purpose, it wouldn't end here. Chris agreed. The man put her on the nearest bench and ran after the car, which stood at the end of the alley. The woman sat all pale, unable to understand what it all meant, but she could definitely feel the strongest fear inside her. What do they want from me? She tried to find an answer. Who are these people? If they were sent by Kieran, then they would just scare me then. But from what this man told me, they wanted to steal me. Some sort of car showed up and the man who had rescued her stopped in front of her. Chris sat down with him and explained where her car was parked. "You know, I don't think it's all a coincidence," the stranger, who introduced himself as Victor, pondered. "I can't help but get the feeling that they were deliberately hunting you. I'm sorry, it's none of my business. But maybe you owed someone money or crossed the road." He tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. "Yeah, I've never been in business at all," Chris sighed, "just my husband. But he died a few months ago. I don't know what these people wanted from me, but maybe he didn't give the money to someone." True. Vince tried to continue in that direction. If he's a businessman, they don't forgive that kind of thing. I know. The man turned into the narrow streets, but as soon as he hit the wide road, he felt a hard bump from behind. He lost control and crashed into a yard, knocking down an old wooden fence and driving into the back. "Shit," he cursed. Vince jumped out of the car at once. A woman with a small child in her arms was staring at him in horror. "I'm sorry. We got hit," he tried to explain to the woman. "Let's settle this without the police." Vince took a large sum of money out of his wallet. Now the woman looked at him in amazement. She'd never had that kind of money. She had the most miserable house on the street. The landlady counted the 5,000 bills. There were exactly 300,000 rubles. She didn't really need the fence. She could rebuild the wreckage, but to feed 5 children on such a sum was just luck for her. It didn't have to be a fight, and Vince, apologizing again, drove out onto the street. "Please give me your card number." "I'll wire you the money right away," Chris told him. "Chris, were they trying to kill us?" He didn't answer her question. "Do you realize that? This is a sad turn of events. But now I can't understand which of us is being hunted, you or me. Do you think it was done on purpose? The passenger was frightened." "Oh my God, I don't get it." "Neither do I," agreed Vince. "But one thing is certain, it was the same people. The only question is who they were after. Maybe the whole kidnapping scene was staged to make me react to it." The driver sighed. "Shit, I need to get my car repaired now. My side's all banged up." I'll pay for your repairs, Chris insisted. Besides, maybe it's me the after, not you. And why didn't I see the license plate? The car was black. Vince went back into his own thoughts, as if he hadn't been listening to her. They pulled up in front of Chris's car. The woman was reluctant to let go of her new acquaintance. Vince, I insist that I take my car to the body shop and then drive you home, she said sternly. All right, he sighed. Now that we've had this adventure, I hope this is the end of it. I'm going to the police tomorrow, Chris said on the way out. Whether it was an accident or not, it wasn't worth the risk. I'm going to call someone tonight too, Vince decided. I haven't been hunted in a while. Chris waited until Vince was done with his car. Finally, he got out and sat down beside her. What an adventure, he laughed. I haven't been this nervous in a long time. Even when they tried to poison me, I somehow got over it. They tried to poison you? Chris looked at him in horror. My God, can such a thing happen? She asked naively. Well, if you cross someone, the stakes get too high, Vince replied. Before he could say anything, his gaze fell on the mirror. The man turned back sharply, but it was too late. The car had gone airborne. Chris felt a strong headache. It prevented her from opening her eyes. The woman moaned. Her whole body seemed to be on fire. With every cell in her body, she was in extreme pain. What happened to me? She tried to remember, but the thoughts made her dizzy. Toward the end of the day, Chris did manage to open her eyes. Everything in front of her was spinning. It took her another 2 days to speak normally. Thank God you're awake. She heard a familiar voice. I was worried sick. Vince appeared beside the victim's bed. His right arm was broken, and his face was bruised. You and I are lucky, he tried to smile. To go up in the air like that and still be alive. You're not too badly hurt either, by the way. You have a concussion. Other than that, you're okay. Did the police come to see you? Chris asked. Are they investigating? She tried to pull herself up, but she felt dizzy. Careful, Vince told her carefully. Yes, it's ongoing, but it's still unclear who was assassinated. I checked my own channels. I don't see anyone following me. There's a suspicious-looking guy, though. I don't know, Chris said through her tears. Oh my God, we almost died. Over the next few days, the woman's life took a major turn. Clearly, she sensed that she needed to come out of her depression, or it would lead to nothing good. I want to live, she told herself. Yes, Aiden is gone, but I'm still here, and I'm still here. Stop burying myself, otherwise, the next time I get attacked will be the last. From that moment on, Chris decided that once she got out of the hospital, she would live her life normally. Would she do something? Maybe even get married. Until a week ago, the woman had been adamantly against it, but now things had changed dramatically. Within a week, Chris could talk normally. Vince was sent home because he couldn't leave his business for long. In fact, their meeting had been a pure coincidence. The man had never liked the part of town where he and Chris had met. A man had asked him to meet at that cafe to discuss business, but he hadn't come. Vince had been in the facade business for many years. He had his own manufacturing facility. He was one of the first to open one. But as time went on, there was a lot of competition. 5 years ago, he was poisoned at an expensive restaurant where he was invited to a banquet. Vince has been threatened many times. Anyway, he's had a lot going on in his life too. His personal life didn't work out either. His first wife was a Barbie doll. That's what Vince wanted his wife to be. He lived with Vivian for almost 3 years. The latter had gotten so naked that she was spending so much money on herself as if she were royal. The man wasn't greedy, but he didn't like that some girl was living on her own at his expense. He decided to talk to her. I wonder why you did not marry me. The wife was angry. Do you want me to look like some country girl? Viv, I'm not asking you to turn you into a country girl, he objected to her. But buying $500,000 worth of clothes is a bit much. Don't be insolent. Fuck you, she scolded. The girl was too sure of herself. But Vince never forgave disrespect. 2 days later, Vivian knelt before him and apologized. I love you so much, she kissed his hands. Forgive me. I won't spend any more of your money. Vince was somewhat of a judge of character. He knew perfectly well that Vivian would never change. Her husband had only let her keep her clothes and her car, all the expensive jewelry he'd given her back. But Vince wasn't a bachelor for long. The second time around, he decided to tread carefully, so his second wife was Kate. She was almost 7 years older than Vivian. She seemed sensible, poised. Vince had always dreamed of having children. He hoped Kate would finally make him happy. They waited. But 4 years went by and nothing. He grew suspicious of his wife. She didn't spend his money like Vivian did. But the aftermath, there was a different kind of trouble. Kate was a plant. She got his data and sold it. Thank God Vince got out in time. The woman went to prison for fraud. Where are they? Normal women, he thought. The richer they are, the harder it is to find her. Chris sat staring out the window. She wanted to leave these walls as soon as possible. The decision for a new life was getting stronger every day. Good evening, came a voice, and Vince appeared in the room with a huge bouquet of flowers. Chris, how are you? Oh, Vince, good afternoon. Thank you very much, she said. How do you drive with that hand? I don't have a choice. I have to adapt, he smiled. So when will you be discharged? I'd like us to sit somewhere and celebrate. Well, in about a week, she answered. In a way, I'm kind of scared to even leave here. The cops haven't found anyone yet. Well, should we just lie down and die now? Objected the guest. Let them not even hope. That's all they expect from us. I'll tell you something too. I don't hold out much hope for these guys. So I hired my own detective. And I can assure you, he's going to find the men who attacked us. Kieran was sitting in the car, very nervous. After Joe had failed to disarm Chris on his first attempt, fear had settled in him. Finally, Joshua got into his car. Well, are we ready for the second stage? He rubbed his hands together happily. Oh, relax. If all such cases were done the first time, you know how many would have been sent to the grave. Everything is going according to plan. I've got reliable information that she'll be out of the hospital soon, so we'll get her right after that, and you know what I mean. And what if they find us? Kieran had his doubts. I mean, the police are probably already looking for you. Are you joking? Joe laughed. You don't know how they work. If they wanted to, they'd have found us by now. They won't get too involved. But they put in a request, interviewed a couple people. Now they're sitting around waiting for them. I know these guys like the back of my hand. All right. Then keep me in the loop, Kieran asked. I hope you will see this through to the end. At least I hope so, he pondered. But unfortunately, the bandit jumped up on a large bump and the bug flew off to the side. Oh, shit. The detective cursed. All right. I'll try to run every black Niva in town. Maybe the one without license plates will turn up somewhere. The day came when Vince and Chris went to an expensive restaurant. A man picked her up. It had been years since Chris had shown herself off in front of a mirror, but she wanted to look good tonight. There are still some bruises, of course, she laughed, looking in the mirror, but it was all right. Vince drove up to the restaurant, looked around, saw his detective, and calmed down. Chris, on the other hand, was a little nervous. For some reason, it seemed to her that something was bound to happen. Here they come, rejoiced the detective. Let's check one face now. A gray-haired man with a beard approached the car, knocked on the driver's window. The man looked at him unhappily. What do you want? He swore angrily. Son, fall on the bread the old man's way, said the detective. Fuck you, the driver swore, and opening the door, shoved the grandfather aside. Is that him? Rejoiced the detective. He quickly photographed the bandit's face with a hidden camera. The old man came in from the other side. Now he knocked on the passenger window. The window opened. What's the matter, old man? Can't you understand the first time? Get out of here, the other thug swore. The detective's cameras took a picture of the second face. Now he had to follow these men. Chris, we met under some strange circumstances, Vince said. You know, it's the first time in my life. I like to plan things, and then bam. You know, I've been living in a fantasy world for the last 3 years, so it's been a stimulating experience for me, she smiled. At first, my husband was ill. I threw all my strength into the fight. Then after his death, everything became black and white. I understand. I also have such moments, and if it were not for my business, which keeps me afloat, so to speak, I would probably have drunk or done something to myself. Sometimes you get so depressed that you just don't want to live, said Vince, so for me, my salvation is in my work. I want to do something too, Chris agreed, but I don't know where to go or what to do. I'm afraid I don't have the experience to organize something. Chris, it's always like that, the man reasoned. It takes a few mistakes to realize which path is the right one for you. It's natural. You just have to accept it. And do you realize how many people there are out there who don't have the opportunities you have? They spend all their time working to make ends meet. Or they live like that woman whose fence we rammed into the other day. So, as they say, God be with you. The important thing is to get started. The time passed quickly. Vince answered the phone from time to time, but Chris felt at ease in his company. It had been a long time since she'd spent time with strange men. But, to tell the truth, Vince didn't seem like a stranger to her. I hope this isn't our last dinner together, Vince said when he brought her home. Chris lowered her eyes shyly. Vince was a breath of fresh air in her gray, unbroken life. So, Chris grabbed the old magazines and tossed them on the carpet. What am I going to try to do? She scrutinized the pictures and thought about what other women were doing. She wasn't particularly attracted to fashion, so all sorts of stores, beauty parlors, and so on, it wasn't for her. She lay down on the carpet, closed her eyes, and tried to imagine what she would like. Children immediately popped into her mind. In all the years she had lived with Aiden, she had shoved that desire so deeply that it had never been seen. But now the woman was giving herself free rein. I want children, she said aloud, a boy and a girl. And the woman smiled at her thoughts. Chris began to reason along those lines. It seemed to her that she wanted to go down that path. If they are children, what would we do with them? She uttered aloud. What did I want to do as a child? She wondered, seeing herself in a small house. Her mother was always on the job. She had subsequently gotten married and moved in with her husband. Chris did not want to leave her grandparents. She finished 9 grades and received a secondary education. Her grandfather died shortly before Chris' wedding, and her grandmother died when Aiden was already sick. Her mother had no contact with Chris. Sometimes she really wanted to find her, but she was afraid that she would tell her that she didn't need her. Otherwise, like any normal mother, she would seek to meet her. Of course, what I wish most of all is that my mother had been present in my childhood, the woman said aloud. The memories reopened old wounds. Tears ran down her cheeks. Perhaps somewhere deep in her heart, Chris was glad that Aiden couldn't have children. She had a fear that she might be a bad mother, too. Okay, she put it aside despite her ruined mood. Chris felt like she needed to go in that direction because, well, they were watching her. All I've been able to find out are their faces, the detective told her. Why would they want her? I haven't found out yet. But judging from these men, either someone has ordered her, or they themselves want to steal her for the purpose of blackmail. I've got a rough idea where they are. I can't tell you the exact address yet, but it'll all come out soon. Sash. Okay, I'm asking you to track them all down so we can get there before it's too late, the man said concernedly. We need to save her. Vince was very worried about Chris. He realized that she wouldn't be able to defend herself. She had no experience with such thugs. She was a pure and naive woman, and that made her even more vulnerable to the enemy. The detective had already realized that these two weren't making this up. They were working for someone. That day, his intuition kicked in, and he spent the day outside Chris's house. Everything was quiet. It was getting towards evening when 2 men in police uniforms showed up at Chris's gate. They rang the intercom. Sorry, we couldn't reach you, it said. We need you to come with us to the police. 10 minutes later, the landlady came out. A car drove right up to them. It was already dark. Chris got into the car, and the car started. The detective shined his flashlight and was startled to see the strange license plates. Shit, he cursed and immediately called Vince. I'll try to catch up with them. My car's at the beginning of the street. Vince, I need help. Chris saw another cop sitting in the back seat next to her. The woman felt uneasy. Before she could ask what was wrong, the man clamped his hand over her mouth and held something to her nose. Chris blacked out. The car rushed forward at full speed. This time, the bandits were using a different car. Joshua didn't wait any longer. He decided to act decisively this time. He quickly started the car and drove onto the highway. It was dark. The streetlights didn't illuminate the road well enough to see the car and the surrounding area. There was a problem with the streetlights at Chris's house that day. She later realized that it was just a coincidence. No strangers had entered her house. The bandits pulled over to the curb. One of them covered the other while he changed license plates. The old plates went into the ditch. The bags of police uniforms followed. The car pulled forward a little when the same bandit who had changed the plates poured 5 liters of water on the spot where the car had just been parked. Her footprints were blurred and so were the shoe marks. The detective couldn't drive fast. He had to keep looking around. His gaze fell on something sticking out in the ditch. He quickly ran out there and saw the strange license plate he had noticed on that car. He called Vince right away. Andrew, I'll be right there. The police are also on their way, Vince said excitedly as he continued his pursuit. I'll be in touch the whole time. Stay on the line. The cops can hear everything through me. The detective commented on what was going on all the way, but he couldn't catch up with the car. He didn't know that the bandits had turned onto a country road that went through the woods and from there led to New Village. There Joshua still had the old house where his mother had lived. Finally, the detective was overtaken by Vince and a policeman. The situation was very dangerous. It was nighttime, and anything could have been done to Chris, so that no one would ever find her again. If they split up, they could turn off somewhere deep in the woods. The 3 police cars split up. Vince went with Andrew. They stopped every now and then and looked into the darkness. Look over here, shouted the detective. Look, there's a patch of grass. A car could have driven through here. It's a forest, said the man doubtfully. We've got nothing to lose, though. Let's go check it out. Vince's car went first. Tree branches snapped at it every now and then on the road, but Andrew knew at once that someone had driven through here recently. He saw several broken branches. Then they pulled onto a wider road. The driver stopped and gave the police his coordinates. They wanted to see something else and join them on the way. We're about to reach the village, Vince said into the microphone. Andrew, are you okay? You okay? I'm fine, the detective replied. Vince, we need to hurry. I feel like we don't have much time. Vince stepped on the gas. 20 minutes later, they pulled into the sleeping village. There were no streetlights anywhere. Rarely were there any lights on near anyone's house. Vince got out of the car, and the dogs were barking. That was not good for them at all. The men drove down all 3 streets, peering into yards, but saw nothing suspicious. Suddenly, the detective saw a lone building in the distance. They headed straight for it. Andrew peered in and in the darkness could barely make out a car, but whether it was the same car or not, it was hard to see. The man carefully climbed over the fence. Joe, there's a car at the house, said one of the thugs nervously, looking through a small opening. All the windows in the house were boarded up. The leader was not afraid. The main thing is to keep the police out, and we can handle the guests, he said. The detective shined his flashlight and saw that the rooms had been hastily covered up. Everything looked a little crooked. Vince tried the door, but it was locked. Then he knocked. Andrew hid near the wall, but no one answered. The door was still locked. Suddenly it opened sharply, and someone pulled Vince inside. The detective didn't even realize it. He cautiously stepped outside and called for the police. "Get over here now. We're in danger," he whispered. "We need help now. We found them." "Who the hell are you?" Joshua stared defiantly into the eyes of Vince, who was being held by two men. "What do you say, Annie?" "I'm here for Chris. You have her." The guest spoke boldly. "I followed your trail." Chris, who squinted his eyes at the leader, "We're in a different business here. We don't deal in women. You want a taste?" He handed him something. "No, I don't use," Vince answered at once. "What do you want it for?" "Give it to me. I'll pay you well." "I'm telling you, we're the only ones here. Besides, you've come at a bad time. You're going to have to pay for your freedom," Joshua laughed. "I know you have it," Vince persisted. "Tell me, who hired you?" "You don't need it, do you?" "Listen," Joe grabbed him by the head. "Don't get on my nerves. Don't you get it the first time?" And he slapped him across the face with all his might. Somehow Vince managed to break free, and he went for the ringleader. He hit the guest with such ferocity that he fell unconscious. There was a rustling sound, and the bandits became alert. Joshua grabbed Vince and began to cover himself with him. In a moment, the door was kicked open. Two policemen appeared in the old house. "Throw him down," one of them ordered. "I guarantee you that you'll stay alive." "Fuck you," Joshua put the knife even closer to Vince's throat. A moment later, a gunshot came from the side. Joe went down. The other thugs immediately put their hands in the air. Some of the police began to search the house. They found Chris tied up in the basement. She had regained consciousness, but since she had a gag in her mouth, the woman could not scream. Vince was cleaned up, too. "Well, it's definitely over now," he mumbled to Chris, who was crying all the time. "Chris, it's going to be all right." The investigation didn't take long. Very quickly, the police came up with Kieran, who was a customer in the case. Emma and Lexi told them right away. The latter were not aware of Joshua's case. He hadn't told them anything, and he didn't want to. His plans weren't to live with Lexi for long. He just wanted to take advantage of them until he got his money. No matter how hard Kieran tried to dodge it, he did go to jail. After a year and a half, he was put on probation. It was 3 months later. Chris sat at home, thinking about Vince. Now that it was over, she could admit to herself that she cared about him. "If it weren't for him, I'd be dead," she whispered. "I liked him right away." Vince hadn't realized he'd fallen in love. He really liked Chris. She was everything he was looking for in a woman. "I can't take it anymore," he said to himself and ran outside, stopping at a flower store and buying a large bouquet. They were supposed to have dinner together this weekend, but Vince realized he needed Chris now. "Vince," the hostess was surprised to see him come in. "It's so good to see you." "I didn't call you. You're busy." Chrissy took her hand. "I love you. I don't want us to see each other only on official occasions anymore. Marry me." The woman looked at him and didn't know what to say. She didn't expect it to happen like this. "You know that you and I have already been together for better and for worse, so we both have nothing to lose," she laughed. "Is that so?" He was wary and froze. "Of course it is," she looked intently into his eyes. "I didn't expect this to happen in my life, but I love you." "No buts." Vince lifted her into his arms. "Chris, let's put our past behind us after all. Right from today, let's start a new life. Let's do it." "I agree," she said, "because I'm happy. Thank you for everything. You're my angel, my savior. But I can still do a lot of things." The man laughed and touched her face with his hand. The wedding was modest. One might even call it a party. Neither Vince nor Chris wanted loud guests. Only the most important people were present. The newlyweds, happy, looked at each other through the thorny path. They had finally found each other, and that was the most important thing. A couple of months passed after marriage, and Chris decided to open a children's sports center for sick children. She was apprehensive at first, but Vince gave her courage and strength. "Chris, but if you wanted to do it, why not give it a go? We've got the money. You want to start by renting a small space. Try to pick a few areas. What can kids with disabilities do?" "I think there's a lot of things," Vince said. "It's not really a sport for them. It's more of a game," replied Chris. "Well, find people who can advise you on this, and then you'll be able to choose your directions easily." Vince helped Chris every step of the way. In the beginning, she was terrified of everything. She was especially afraid of making mistakes. But thanks to her husband, she quickly began to treat them as he did. "Every mistake is a stepping stone," Vince liked to say. "It's good to see that something isn't working. Then you can let it go." Problems start when people don't recognize mistakes. They say they're doing well, But at the same time they're failing. Something's not working. And if you openly say, yes, it's a mistake, and it's preventing me from seeing what's best for me, then why not put it behind you? So step by step, Chris's brainchild was born. From a timid homebody, she gradually turned into the director and manager of her center. And after 3 years, her business was up and running. Wow, laughed husband. You are now less often at home than I am. I see that you are completely immersed in your direction. After all, I do not cease to be surprised every day how much it is mine, said the wife. At first it was awkward and painful for me to work with disabled children, but now it's just my life. I don't aspire to raise Paralympians, but giving them an interest in life is something I can and want to do. Chris was so immersed in her work that when she felt dizzy and nauseous one morning, she didn't think much of it. It wasn't until it started happening almost every day that the woman started to think. Jesus, she stared at the toast, weeping. Was everything tearing up in front of her eyes? That afternoon, Chris, very excited, was coming home. She was now responsible not only for other people's children, but also for her own child. She shifted her hands nervously. Vince wasn't there yet. Chris didn't want to tell him that over the phone. Finally, the door opened. Her husband walked in. Vince, a woman rushed over to him. Wiaya. She burst into tears. Chris, what's wrong? Did someone hurt you? Are you sick? Come on, tell me. You're going to be a daddy. The wife finally spoke up. I'm pregnant. You see, Elizabeth is your daughter, all right, Sharon said in a confident tone as she examined little Holly. She had just turned 2 months old, but she seemed to have grown a couple of centimeters since her last visit. But thank goodness, the young mom exhaled with relief. Thank you, Sharon, for coming right away. As soon as I saw the rash, I started imagining all sorts of horrors. I thought of all kinds of things. And do not need unnecessary imagination, said the pediatrician after checking the arms and legs of the baby for the last time. It is better to call me right away, and then you yourself are nervous, and the child with his mood worry. She feels everything, even though she's just a baby. Right, Holly? Sharon smiled at the baby, and she bounced happily in response. Oh, what would we do here without you? Elizabeth said sincerely, putting her hand to her heart. How good it is that they send such wonderful and caring specialists to us in such a remote area. Sharon said nothing. She smiled politely and began to pack her medical case. The woman turned 35 this year, but she worked and lived in a small southern village lost in the depths of Siberia. For almost 2 years now, Sharon had been assigned a small, bright house and her own office in the local hospital, the only one for many dozens of kilometers around. Despite the fact that Sharon, being a native of Moscow, was accustomed in her work and daily life to completely different conditions, the modest and somewhere even harsh life of the Siberian wilderness did not frighten her at all. The woman found in such an existence a kind of special spirituality, like that felt by monks, praying in their ascetic cells in ancient monasteries. Sharon, wait. The pediatrician heard a familiar voice behind her. Charlotte. A kind-hearted, blonde-haired woman who worked on a local farm was hurrying toward her, carrying a large, labeled can. Charlotte, don't shout like that. You mustn't shout. You might fall, she said, looking at the woman rushing toward her. The milkmaid only waved her hand. What can I do? We're all used to it here, Charlotte said, puffing out her breath after a brisk walk. Sometimes you rush in at dawn, don't you? You think she'll be all right, especially if she's expecting a calf. Sharon, I brought you some fresh milk, said the villager, holding out a can to the pediatrician. It was a particularly good milk yield. No, Charlotte, no need, tried to refuse the doctor. But the milkmaid was very persistent. Take it, she shook her head. Do you know how much of this stuff I have at home? But you still need it more. Your work is so important. You treat our children every day until night on rounds. It's not just milk, it's nothing. Charlotte just did not spit on the ground from irritation, remembering the previous pediatrician. For you, do you know what kind of doctor she was? She basically didn't care about the kids. Only did what came to the hospital to gossip, all the gossip we'll discuss. She'd put all kinds of makeup on her face and twirl her tail in front of our paramedic. Sharon hurried to take the can and thank the woman. She sensed Charlotte was about to get back on her favorite horse, and so she did. But whatever that St. Petersburg goat does, Charlotte continued to rage, no matter how much she tortured him. Vincent wouldn't even notice her, for crying out loud. "I hear you, Charlotte, but I really have to go. I've got a lot of paperwork to do at the hospital." But Charlotte was unstoppable. She couldn't rest until she'd spoken her thoughts and feelings to the end. That was her broad country nature. "Vincent's a different kind of bird. He's a what's-his-name, isn't he?" The woman thought of the right word and was silent for a moment. "Aesthete. That's not the kind of girl he wants." Charlotte looked at Sharon with a cheerful slyness and finished. "Like you would find my wife quiet, calm, so that in the children of her soul to put her soul." The young pediatrician was embarrassed, feeling herself blushing to the roots of her hair. "Sharon, please," Charlotte continued. "You should look at him, and Vincent, as soon as he lost his wife. So consider, 5 years as a widower. He doesn't fit in here. He came to us from the capital too." Sharon truly wanted to go to hell at that moment. She quickly mumbled something about not having time. She thanked him again for the milk and hurried away from the chatty Charlotte. Everyone, literally everyone in the village was wooing her to Vincent, the local paramedic. Sharon didn't argue he was a good-looking man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a gait full of dignity, and only 5 years older than her. But despite the attention Vincent was showing her, Sharon didn't reciprocate it. To her, the handsome widower paramedic was just a pleasant colleague who had no feelings for her at all. And how could it be otherwise when the young pediatrician's heart was forever occupied by another man, her own husband? Sharon hurried to push the sad thoughts away. All the more so as the modest, beige and light gray building of their rural hospital loomed ahead. As she walked up the porch steps, she thought about how lucky she was that the people here had received her so warmly and friendly. Not every stranger from the capital city could win the trust of the villagers. Sharon, however, had managed to become practically one of their own. It was largely because she was literally obsessed with her work. And now, entering her cozy little office, the woman wanted to start filling out some paperwork right away, when her attention was attracted by a huge, lush bouquet on her desk. Someone had managed to put the flowers in a vase so that a wonderful fresh fragrance spilled over the room. That's not all that flashed through Sharon's pediatrician's mind. "I've asked you so many times," she sighed. "Sharon." Knock, knock. "Can I see you?" Vincent's perfect white smile brightened as he slowly pushed his way between the door and her office. "Good afternoon," Vincent Sharon said with a strained smile. "I assume these are flowers from you? Do you like them?" "I thought I'd cheer you up a little. You've been looking a little sad lately. Are you all right?" Sharon put the bouquet under the table and exhaled confidently. "The bouquet is beautiful. You didn't have to go to all that expense." She turned her gaze back to the flowers. "It was enough to wish me a good day. We've been over this, Vincent. I'm very much against any kind of attention in the workplace. Outside of work, too." Vincent's smile faded a little. But the man had no intention of giving up without a fight. "You know, Sharon, sometimes I think you're teasing me on purpose," the paramedic said without changing his face. "I just don't understand why you're doing this to me. To be honest, I'm starting to run out of ideas about what else I could do to please you." Sharon looked tiredly at the persistent suitor. "Vincent, how many times do you have to do this? How can I explain to you that there can be nothing personal between us? I know it's hard for you to accept the fact that I don't want to go out with you. But let's face it, we just want different things out of life. Our personalities don't match." Sharon looked at the paramedic pleadingly. She'd lost count of the number of times she'd tried to explain such seemingly elementary things to him. "It's because you still love your husband," the man asked her painfully. Vincent knew that Sharon didn't like to talk about her past life in the capital, and yet he never missed an opportunity to remind her of her reasons for moving to Yelchihu. Sharon's face instantly became impenetrable. "I'm sorry, Vincent, but I'm really busy right now. I'm afraid we have nothing more to talk about." "I understand your feelings as well as anyone," Sharon, Vincent said in a serious tone. "Believe me, I've been where you are. But sooner or later, you're going to have to get back to real life. Sometimes we have to accept the fact that our nearest and dearest are gone. By letting go of the situation, you can finally look around you and see that there are people around who care about you. I'll be waiting for you. Sharon. I hope you soon realize that you and I have a good chance of making a wonderful family. Sharon looked at the paramedic. Her lips were trembling and her eyes were full of tears. Vincent, please. The woman cried out, pale, unable to contain her emotions, and then she burst into a womanly sob, dropping her head into her hands. Cry, Sharon, cry. Vincent said softly as he left her office. Maybe tears will sober you up. How many times do you have to act like a lady of steel? The woman didn't answer him. She just couldn't talk right now. So the paramedic had to leave her, leaving Sharon with the solitude she wanted. Sharon's mood was completely and utterly ruined. The pediatrician spent the rest of the day filling out the medical records of her young patients and their mothers, as well as seeing the babies in the hospital. The young woman tried to behave as usual, friendly and polite. However, there were cats on her soul. A familiar dull ache, coupled with intense anxiety, had begun to gradually fill her heart ever since Vincent had made her think of her husband again. Ryan, she said to him mentally every time she felt unbearably tormented. I believe we'll meet again. Let others say whatever they want. Remind me that you're probably not alive anymore. I don't believe it. I don't believe it, and I never will. You're so strong, so brave. You couldn't just die then, you couldn't. In the evening, getting ready for bed, Sharon sat for a long time in front of the mirror, looking at her face, which had stopped from heavy thoughts and worries. Who would have thought that in just 3 years the once young, energetic Sharon would suddenly turn into a grief-stricken woman whose gray hair, openly competing with the silver threads in her once perfect dark blonde hair, made her look much older and more serious than she really was. The young pediatrician used to love to read before bed, not professionally, but the most popular fiction she could get her hands on. Favor, in those days, living in the capital, the girl did not lack books. Here the maximum that she could afford was the magazine Bulletin of Medicine, and that by subscription, which she had so thoughtfully registered at the post office on the very day she moved to the village. No online store had ever delivered books to such a remote region. Yes, to be honest, Sharon was no longer drawn to the twisted detective stories or the magical adventures in a love story that she had once loved so much. The world had long ago lost all color for her, and only her work had kept the woman afloat. Immersing herself in the problems of newborns and their young, and sometimes not so young mothers, Sharon thus quenched her own pain, which every time stung her in the very center of her soul. It was worth it for the woman to remember that she herself was incapable of having children. Sharon stood up from the table where the small mirror stood, and out of the corner of her eye she noticed how thin and unattractive her figure had become. The expression that love dries a lonely woman dry described her at that difficult time in her life. She was lonely, and she loved with all her heart and soul, wholeheartedly and boundlessly one and only one person, who most likely was no longer alive. But pediatrician Sharon Kuznetsova couldn't even bear the thought of, as Vincent put it, resigning herself to letting go. Despite all the blackest moments of her reflection, there was still a faint hope in the same heart where the unrelenting pain now lingered. The hope that lifted Sharon in the morning every day and made her believe that one day she would hear the familiar warm voice of her adored husband. That night the woman could not sleep a wink. She kept returning her thoughts to her past, to those wonderful and easy years when she and her husband were truly happy, and nothing had marred their quiet family joy. They had made great plans for the future, and were completely unaware that all their hard-won happiness could collapse in an instant. Sharon felt tears running down her cheeks again. "Oh my God," the woman whispered to herself. "Ryan, honey, I'm sorry I'm such a sentimental fool." Before the inner gaze of poor Kuznetsova again involuntarily flashed colorful pictures of the years lived with her husband, gradually plunging the woman into a strong, but so simultaneously beautiful and sad dream, which the healer of children's diseases would prefer not to see at all, so as not to be even more emotional after her imminent awakening. Sharon had once had a very different life. Bright lights of the capital, work in one of the best clinics of the city, weekend meetings with her friends, and shopping trips to fashionable boutiques. All this was an integral part of the young pediatrician's daily routine. Sharon was born into a good and respected family of doctors. Her mother worked in gynecology all her life, while her father was one of the leading surgeons in Seattle itself. The girl always saw the example of her parents in front of her eyes. Strong, purposeful, they went straight to their goal and achieved everything themselves, thanks to their own diligence and natural talents, as well as the desire to constantly learn and develop in their chosen field. But besides all this, they also loved each other without memory, despite the fact that they lived together for almost 25 years. Their daughter dreamed of continuing the noble dynasty of doctors, choosing for herself the direction of pediatrics. Thus, Sharon was able to combine in one profession at once two of her passions, medicine and work with children. The girl studied easily and with pleasure, and easily graduated from medical school with honors, after which almost immediately got a job in one of the best consultations in the city. From there, she slowly moved to an excellent private clinic, where she worked for the next few years, gradually improving her professional qualifications. She met Ryan as a mature and self-sufficient young woman. She was 26 years old at the time. The young employee of the rescue service conquered Sharon by his strength, virility, but at the same time softness and kindness. Sharon had never met a man as understanding as Ryan. At that time, she had already had several unsuccessful romances, and she was disappointed in the opposite sex, intending to devote herself fully to work alone. That year, she and a couple of other specialists from the clinic were sent under a general quota for training in the so-called survival course. And that's where the girl first saw her future husband. The muscular blonde instructor immediately made her heart beat faster. His neat 3-day stubble looked so natural, but at the same time stylish, that Sharon involuntarily thought to herself, is he not watching her in some special way to keep her in such an attractive condition for all women? Being naturally shy and modest, Sharon didn't know for sure if this amazing young man would pay attention to her. So she simply continued her studies, trying to focus on the main thing she'd been sent here for. "Did you like our handsome instructor too?" Sharon Tora, her roommate in the student-employee dormitory and part-time young gynecologist, prodded her. "Now that's the kind of guy who's got some dignity. I've seen the way he carries himself. Like he knows he's got manners superior to any of us. We'll be on the hook in no time." "You got it, Tora." Sharon shrugged it off. She felt the color flood her normally so calm and clear face. "What are you talking nonsense again? He's handsome, of course, but nothing more than that," she said. "You were staring at him when he was giving CPR to that mannequin." She made a joke about her, that's all. "I imagined him doing the same to you." Tora rolled her eyes dreamily. Sharon just pressed her lips tighter together, looking down at her adorable nose. "Fuck, Tora. You look like a grown-up girl, but you're acting like a teenager, honestly. It's disgusting." "What's disgusting? You think if you act like a saint, he'll pay attention to you right away." Tora easily straightened her curly hair with her fingers. "You have to be brave, Sylvia. Now, men have long ago not modesty in women appreciate, and what is scientifically called initiative. Let others take the initiative." "I'm a fan of more classic courtship," Sharon said calmly. "If we're to meet, he'll be the first to announce his intention. And I, as a decent girl, will see if I should build a relationship with him, or if he's just a frivolous man, in a word." Tora shook her head reproachfully. "That's why Peter and Nick both ran away from you with their heels glistening. You're too picky. Do you think long and hard before you make the first move? Look, Sylvia, there's a lot of pretty girls here besides you and me. They might be ahead of you." "I don't want him." "Tora, calm down." Sharon had no stomach for it, but then she felt her heart racing, as if she were already jealous of Ryan's jealousy of some ephemeral other hottie her roommate had just told her about. All right, I'll shut up," Tora smiled, turning in her bed to her other side and adding, "Tomorrow we have our final class. There it is, your chance, take it. Or are you going to miss out on your happiness again?" Sharon didn't say anything. She just turned her back to the wall. Her face burned like she'd been rubbed with red pepper. Her heart was galloping in her chest, so that she thought Tora would hear that strange sound in the silence of the night room. It was the first time since their last breakup, or perhaps in her entire life, that Sharon had felt such strong emotions toward a complete stranger. What nonsense, the girl said to herself. Brian's? You haven't exchanged a word with him in 2 weeks, and already you're asking him to marry you? You fool, go to sleep. Tora's right. Tomorrow's the big day, the last class, which she needs to pass with flying colors. And she came here for a reason? With such exciting thoughts, the girl fell asleep that night. Strange as it may seem, the next day went quite smoothly. Sharon passed the exam with a solid A and was preparing to go with the other girls to the creative evening, organized for them by the base staff. At the moment when the girl was scrutinizing herself in the mirror, trying to make sure that the dress she had chosen was not too short for such an event, a quiet knock sounded at the door of her room. "Come in, who's there?" The girl shouted into the hallway, while adjusting the massive round earrings of silver and enamel in her ears. Someone silently came inside and stopped behind Sharon's back. The girl flinched when she saw a familiar, but unexpected reflection in the mirror. "Is that you? God, you scared me," Sharon exclaimed, turning around. In front of her stood the same instructor, Ryan Smith, whom she had been thinking about so often the last few days. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that at all," the boy said, and lowered his stunning blue eyes in embarrassment. In his hand was clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, which he, shyly, slowly extended to the girl. "Here, this is for you." "I'm sorry, I didn't know what kind of flowers you prefer, but we have amazing nature here. So I thought maybe the local flora would make you happy." Sharon looked up at him, her dark gray eyes wide with amazement. Ryan's face gradually flushed with a delicate blush, just as it must have done on her skin now. "It's my pleasure," she said, taking the bouquet from him. "They are really beautiful flowers, better than any roses." A shy hopefulness flashed in Ryan's eyes. "I was wondering if you wouldn't mind going to the dance with me. We're having some sort of disco at the end of the night. It's funny, of course, grown men dancing to popular tunes. But still, I've been looking at you since last week." He was embarrassed. "I apologize for being so frank, but Sharon, I like you very much, so I'd like you to do me the honor of spending this evening with me as my companion." Sharon's excitement made her speechless for the first minute. To think of it, the harsh-looking lifeguard turned out to be such a gentle and vulnerable person. One could never guess what was behind the facade of a male brutality and outward calmness. Ryan, it turned out, had been feeling the same way she had. "Of course I'll say the honor," she replied jokingly, and smiled sweetly at her chosen one. "Just promise me that you won't smoke too much. You know, there is nothing worse than a partner who smokes before the dance. I just can't stand cigarette smoke very well." Ryan's face lit up with a bright and pleasant smile. "That's a wish I can easily fulfill by pretending to be a fairy genie," the young man said. He folded his hands in the typical genie gesture and bowed slightly to Sharon. Sharon didn't know where to put her embarrassment. "God, forgive me for this indiscretion," she exclaimed. "I should have known that many of your employees are in favor of a healthy lifestyle. It's just that both of my previous admirers were not averse to the occasional cigarette. And it was a pain in the ass for me." Sharon looked into Ryan's blue eyes and bit her tongue. Who was she to bring up past men? But today the lifeguard took her words to heart. He didn't seem at all embarrassed by the mention of the girl's past romances. Ryan, giving her his elbow like a real gentleman, took her straight to the local house of culture, where the lifeguards had already prepared a wonderful concert for all the students with jokes, poems, and even songs of their own composition. Sharon liked the latter very much and made a great impression on her. That evening the girl listened to a real bard's song for the first time. "Thank you for this wonderful evening," she thanked her companion when the dance was over and they slowly walked under the blossoming apple trees to the girls' dormitory. "It's been a long time since I've felt so, I don't know, so free. I guess it was so easy to get away from the daily routine and the ubiquitous hustle and bustle." "Yeah," Ryan said, agreeing with her. "I've always felt that this place has a special energy. It's like nothing special, just an ordinary base in the suburbs. But once you get a few kilometers away from the city, it's like a whole different world. No high rises, no shopping centers. At every step there is only a quiet, measured life, where everyone can find his real place." Sharon looked at Ryan and couldn't believe her happiness. Here he was, the man who understood her inner state more than anyone. No matter how much she loved the city with its frenzied pace of life, bright, sometimes shouting windows, ubiquitous cafes and stores, but only here, many kilometers away from the metropolis, She truly felt what life was. It was as if all her senses were heightened in an instant, giving her some secret, but at the same time so simple knowledge. Every person has a true purpose. It is only necessary to follow it at the call of your heart, and then harmony and grace will come into your life. Sharon suddenly looked at him seriously. "Ryan," she said, "can I see you again? I don't mean to be impertinent, but I just think that something good could happen between us." "Sure," Ryan assured her calmly. "Let's exchange phone numbers. I'll text you as soon as I get into town." Ryan smiled so joyfully and childishly that Sharon's heart was immediately warmed by the warmth of the light feeling that was budding in her soul. Back in the metropolis, Sharon thought a lot about what this amazing trip had given her. Should she write to Ryan herself? Or was it better to wait until he was free to make the first move? The girl's doubts were dispelled when a few days later she received the following message on her phone: "I'll be in town the other day. Do you want to meet in the park?" Without thinking for a second and trembling with joy, Sharon immediately replied, "Yes, I'll be looking forward to seeing you." The girl received a playful smiley face in response, and then exhaled with relief. It seems that a new stage in her life was beginning. The first date was followed by several more, and soon the relationship between the young people became really serious. Ryan and Sharon couldn't seem to spend a day apart. They were constantly on the phone, calling each other and sending each other cute postcards. Just like young college students just getting their first taste of true love. Less than 6 months later, Ryan proposed to Sharon. The girl naturally agreed, promising the young lifeguard that she would make him the happiest man in the world. "I'm the one who should promise you such things." Baby Ryan kissed his bride and said, pleasantly surprised, "Remember, a man's duty is to take care of his woman and give her only love and joy, but also to protect her." "You'll never regret being my wife," Ryan said to Sharon. Sharon's parents approved of their daughter's choice. Ryan instilled confidence in them and said the normal, right things. And after talking to Dustin, the girl's father, he became like family to them. "I grew up in an orphanage," Ryan told them honestly, "but I know what a real family should be like. Sharon had told me a lot about your relationship with Brenda. If I can come even an inch closer to something like that in my marriage to your daughter, I'd be happy." "It's good that you intend to make my daughter happy," Dustin told him. "But what about the fact that your job is dangerous? You might leave me alone. What then?" That question didn't bother Ryan at all. "We have all the security measures in place at the base. Yeah, there's a monthly diagnostic on vehicles and equipment. And in case of any damage, parts or technically important parts of the equipment are replaced immediately." Ryan spoke to the bride's father as if he were reporting on the condition of the facility to his superiors clearly and precisely, so that the man had no doubts. His job, though it entailed a risk to life, they had everything they needed to avoid that risk. As for Brenda, she accepted her future son-in-law as if he were her own son. The woman was worried that Ryan, being from an orphanage, had not received enough maternal warmth in his childhood, and therefore at every opportunity she tried to feed the young man with homemade pastries or hot soup. "Try this bread," Sharon's mother said, setting a plate of her specialty soup in front of Ryan. "I made it especially for you. I had a feeling you and my daughter would drop by today." Ryan was embarrassed to refuse, even though Sharon's mom's soup seemed a little heavy for him. As he thanked Brenda for the treat, he chuckled at Sharon, who also understood, but couldn't stop her mother's kindness. "I don't suppose you've ever had soup like this before." Brenda continued to fuss over Ryan. "Sharon can make it too. Don't forget to remind me more often. She's been doing nothing but eating on the run lately with her job." "She can't do that now. She's getting married, after all. And now it is already normal for him to feed and eat well, so that the baby you have soon." Sharon blushed like a boiled lobster. Come on. What baby? What baby? We're not married yet. We're not even getting married for another month. Ryan and I wanted to live a little for ourselves before we thought about kids." There was an awkward silence. Ryan looked expressively at his fiancée and then at his parents' disappointed faces. "A little bit." "How long is this going to take?" Brenda asked with sadness in her voice. "I hope you won't be one of those modern couples who think it's better to have 3 cats, a dog, and a parrot than to have a couple of big kids. You're not one of those, are you?" What? No, of course not, Sharon exclaimed immediately. I can't believe you would think such a thing. Ryan and I are perfectly normal people, and we're going to have kids. Just not so soon. I want to work a little longer, to finally realize I'm a professional first. Honey, there's nothing stopping you from pursuing your interests in pediatrics and being a mom at the same time, Dustin said reasonably. We're not old anymore, and we'd like to nurse our grandchildren while we still have the energy. All Sharon wants to say is Ryan suddenly joined the conversation, that she and I have decided to wait a year or two until we decide we're ready for a baby. No one's talking about taking away the joy of having grandchildren, Dustin, his future son-in-law, reassured him. Well, if that's the time frame we're talking about, that's fine, Dustin chewed his lip. All right. You can live for yourself for now. Just don't take too long. Sharon's at the right age. There's no telling what kind of pregnancy complications might arise if she wanted to have a baby after 30. Sharon clutched the spoon as hard as she could. As much as she loved her parents, such concern about her condition and the possibility of giving birth made her slightly panicky. The girl had always known she wanted to be a mother, but she wanted to decide for herself at what age and exactly how that would happen. Her father and mother kept pushing her, scaring her that her childbearing age had already crossed, in their opinion, all reasonable boundaries. Sharon still had fresh memories of how upset Brenda had been when she had broken up with her last boyfriend. Or rather, the real reason for her upset had not been her daughter's personal tragedy, but the fact that she hadn't thought to get pregnant by her boyfriend so that she could, as her mother had put it at the time, have a baby for herself and thereby bring closure to their family. Sharon felt Ryan squeeze her other hand under the table. His gaze seemed to say to her, "Calm down, this doesn't change anything. We're still going to do things the way we want to do them." Sharon smiled at her fiancé and thought again about how lucky she was to have met a man who truly understood her. Sharon's wedding was modest. On the groom's side were only a few of his best friends from the squad. On the bride's side were friends, relatives, and a couple of her father's good friends, who had been specially invited from the Department of Health. Sharon and Ryan had decided on purpose not to have a lavish celebration. They were going to use some of the money they had saved for the down payment on the mortgage. Young people dreamed of their own apartment, as Sharon all this time lived with her parents, and Ryan and et al. On a rented apartment. However, Brenda and Dustin gave the couple a royal gift for the wedding. Here, Dustin said to Ryan, handing him the keys to their new apartment. It's a 2-bedroom in the center of town, close to the subway. 10 minutes and Sharon can easily get to the clinic without traffic, and you'll be able to take a shortcut to your job too. Ryan didn't know how to thank his father-in-law, so he just hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dustin," the groom said sincerely. "If you only knew how grateful we are." "Don't mention it," said the bride's father. "I do it first of all for my daughter, to make her life more comfortable. You take care of her and do not forget about the grandchildren. My mother and I will be waiting for them very much," the elderly surgeon reminded his son-in-law, and then jokingly wagged his finger at Ryan. When she learned that she and her husband would now have their own apartment, Sharon squealed with delight and threw herself on her father's neck. "Daddy, my love," she said, kissing her father on the cheeks. "You are the best. My darling. How did you and Mom manage it?" Dustin said, infected with joy for his daughter. "I knew you'd be getting married soon. So my mom and I decided to prepare a family nest for you in advance. We're not animals. We know how hard it is for young people to get their own place these days." Sharon and Ryan felt the happiest they'd ever felt. They bravely looked forward to the future and believed that a long and wonderful family life was ahead of them. The first 2 years flew by like a blink of an eye for the young family. Sharon worked at the clinic all the time, and in the evening she turned into a desperate housewife, always cooking something delicious and unusual to please her husband, returning late at night from his dangerous service. Ryan, on the other hand, was constantly on the road. He had been in all kinds of extreme situations. Sharon, of course, worried about her husband with all her heart. And every time she waited with bated breath for a call from him. But God willing, everything was fine, despite the fact that Ryan had to pull people out from under the rubble, and for zealous fishermen chase away from the pond that was half standing, and much more. And then a joyous event happened in their family. One evening, when Ryan returned from work, Sharon met him with eyes burning with happiness and slyly glittering. "What is it, honey? What's wrong?" asked his beloved wife. "I have a surprise for you," Sharon told him confidentially and pulled him into the living room. There on the exquisitely set table, Ryan was waiting for a festive dinner, which he had not received from his wife for a long time. In the center, a large French baked chicken and wine awaited him on a huge porcelain platter. Nearby in pots lay boiled sweet potatoes and corn and fresh seafood, which Sharon had thoughtfully laid out on a separate platter. On the other side of the table, appetizing fruit was in a tall vase, and a bottle of excellent wine stood next to it. And for some reason, a carton of orange juice. "Wow," Ryan marveled sincerely. "We're having such a party for some reason." The man kissed his wife and looked at her questioningly. "Did you get a promotion?" "Well," Sharon said evasively, "you could say that. Just not as much of a promotion as you'd think." "Yes," said the husband, intrigued. Then his wife sent him off to wash his hands while she laid out clean napkins. She really wanted to make this evening memorable for them for a long time, and for that everything had to look just perfect. "But what's the surprise?" Ryan asked a little later, when she sat him down at the table and put the steaming chicken on his plate. "I'm all excited to find out." Ryan jokingly jingled his fork and knife, showing that he was both very hungry and waiting for his wife's response. "I'll tell you everything now, just for starters." "Open the juice and wine, please. I can have juice." Ryan didn't understand his wife's hint at first and started calmly unscrewing the cork from the bottle of wine. "Wait, why do you want juice?" When it suddenly dawned on him. Sharon tried unsuccessfully to suppress a smile, but she could feel herself starting to blush again. She covered her lips with her hand and looked at her husband eloquently. "You mean you're pregnant?" Ryan asked quietly. Sharon lowered her eyes, then nodded affirmatively. "God, baby, we're having a little one." "Oh, honey, sweetheart, I'm so happy," he exclaimed. "And I'm going to be a father, a father." Ryan almost dropped the bottle, trying to jump up from the table and hug his wife. When he succeeded, he twirled Sharon in a joyful waltz. The young woman laughed and never took her eyes off her beloved husband for a moment. "How many things do we have to do with you now?" hastily said, excited by the happiness of parenthood man. "We need to decide where the nursery will be, the crib to choose. Have you told your parents yet?" "Not yet," with a laugh, shaking her lush hair, his wife answered him. "We'll tell them together when we go to Mom and Dad's next weekend." Ryan nodded understandingly. "God, Sharon," I thought, "this is happiness. A loving wife and a hot dinner every day, a loyal support system. But this is something else entirely. I love you so much, my darling. I love you so much." Or Ryan and Sharon. An exciting but beautiful day began. Everything seemed to be the same as before, but now every evening they were together doing things inherent in all future parents. Together they chose a stroller for the baby. They dreamed how they would paint the wall to which they would put the baby's cradle. They argued about whether it would be a boy or a girl, and what name they would give their future baby. One day, when Sharon was already 3 months pregnant, she and Ryan decided to spend a cultural weekend, and therefore went to the theater. There was a new production of the opera The Flying Dutchman, and Sharon really wanted to see it. The play struck a young woman with its scenery and the powerful play of actors. The evening promised to be unforgettable, because after the theater Ryan offered to go to a restaurant. "But after such a 3-hour spectacle, you and I should definitely have something special to eat," Ryan said cheerfully to his wife as they left the theater. "You must be awfully tired. I'd be a terrible husband if I made you cook something at home after all this. No, let's go eat somewhere nice." "If you do that, you'll be the perfect husband," Sharon agreed. "Honestly, I'm ready to eat an elephant right now, or at least a hippopotamus. Those tiny sandwiches in the theater cafeteria didn't impress me at all." Dinner went great. Sharon was getting ready to remember it as one of the most beautiful nights of their lives when the unthinkable happened. The couple was on their way out to the parking lot. Ryan had hailed a cab, and it should have been here any minute, when 3 strange men blocked their way. Judging by the dilated pupils and peculiar odor, these types were clearly under the influence of alcohol or some kind of substance. All three had tattooed arms. "Guys, look at the lovebirds," one of them shouted to the others, and the group instantly began to study Ryan and Sharon. Ryan realized at once what was going on. He threw up his hands in a peaceful manner. "Hey guys, don't worry. Let's break this up amicably. We don't need any trouble." He pulled his wallet out of his jacket pocket and took out all the cash he had. Everything he had. "Guys, really take it, go with God. My wife and I just want to go home." That's all Ryan said, as calmly as possible. But Sharon, frozen in terror, could feel how tense her husband was. The tallest of the three, obviously the leader of the gang, glanced at the small sum Ryan was offering him. Then he took a couple of steps toward Ryan and snatched the money from his hands in one swift movement. Like a monkey finding a new toy at the bottom of its cage, the bandit jumped up and down in front of his henchmen. "Look," he waved the bills in front of their faces. "The people are understanding nowadays. I'm glad I like it." "It's boring," one of them said in a nasty voice, and then he stared at Sharon. "No fights, no chicks for once." The bald, stout man took a slow step toward Ryan's wife. "I think this one's pretty good," the bastard said. "Juicy sweet. Don't you want to have some fun with some normal guys?" Ryan was instantly eager to fight. Sharon felt her mouth go dry. A second later, a nasty, sour lump rose from somewhere in her throat, making the woman instinctively clutch at her stomach, where the life of her small child lay. Fear. A nasty animal fear for the life of her husband and their unborn son or daughter was what Sharon felt at that moment. She pressed herself against her spouse's back, closing her eyes for a second. "Don't go near her," asshole Ryan threw in his face, and immediately assumed a fighting stance. One move and you could kiss your worthless life goodbye. "Wow, this praised piece of shit can also talk," the third bandit, who was very muscular, answered instead of his comrade. "Science. Try saying that again." With these words, the bastard pulled out a shining folding blade, suspiciously resembling a razor. "Not so brave, eh?" said the fat man enigmatically, pointing to his friend's arm. "Now, my friends and I will quickly clean up your face, so that you know how to talk to respectable people. Will your new clothes come with us?" "Don't worry, it's not far to the nearest bushes." All three of them laughed like old hyenas. Ryan was like a rock, ready to make a death-defying leap. "When I say run, just run. Don't look back," Ryan whispered over his shoulder to his wife. No, I'm staying here with you," Sharon slipped into his jacket pitifully. "Come on, honey, come on out to the big guys." "Come on, honey. Come out to the big uncles," the fat thug said. "They want to play with you so badly that your husband can hardly get away with it," he laughed. All three of them lunged at her husband. "Ryan," Tora shouted, and Ryan was immediately engaged in a pitched battle with the three ghouls. He began to strike them with his legs and arms, trying to drive the bandits away from him. The man couldn't make a single grab because he risked slowing down too much, which would be a fatal loss for him. Sharon darted to the right, hoping to outrun the razor-wielding thug, but he was nimble and immediately delivered a powerful blow to the woman's stomach. "Where are you going, Otter?" The thug whispered and grabbed Sharon by the hair, pulling her against him. The woman felt first the stench of his breath, then the cold blade against her tender neck. "Ryan," she screamed, and Ryan immediately lost his guard, taking a crushing blow to the jaw and falling to his knees. "No," Sharon shouted in desperation and kicked him in the groin with all her might. Despite the pain in her stomach, she couldn't let the criminals kill her husband. "She's going to fucking kill him in front of her," the lanky guy shouted, and he and the fat guy started kicking Ryan in the stomach and head area. Sharon managed to escape from the fat man's death throes for a second, but he managed to slash her across the chest with a razor. Lowering her head, the girl saw a scarlet rivulet pouring down her light-colored dress. "Come here, you bitch," the villain growled, and with a short thrust, he jammed the weapon right into Sharon's stomach. In an instant, the world around her became one big blurry blur. The pain was so unbearable that Sharon forgot how to breathe as she whispered her husband's name one last time. She collapsed and fell into darkness. Sharon was consciously aware of the squealing of police sirens. Apparently, the restaurant staff had heard the noise in the backyard and called the police. An ambulance came with them, but Sharon didn't see that. She was surrounded on all sides by a clammy, cold darkness. Sharon. Sharon, can you hear me, sweetheart? Is it me, your husband, Ryan? It was with great difficulty that Sharon opened her eyes. Above her was a perfectly white ceiling that at first even blinded the woman with its light. Next to her, she heard a nasty beeping sound. It was her condition being recorded by special medical devices. Sharon felt a long plastic tube inserted into her nose and cool air flowing through it. Then the woman felt someone gently and tenderly squeezing her hand. Ryan, she said very weakly. Is it really you? Are you alive? Leaning over her, her husband's face confirmed it. I'm a tough nut to crack, thank God. You scared me a lot, sweetheart. I thought I'd lost you. It took Sharon exactly half a second to recall the events leading up to her hospital stay. Baby, the young woman exclaimed in a pale voice and immediately pressed her hand to her belly. It was completely flat and tightly bandaged. Our baby. Ryan. What's wrong with him? I asked my wife, anticipating the worst. Instead of answering, the man lowered his eyes and then ruffled his hair in a nervous motion. The doctors fought for your life for so long. They had no choice. There was no saving our baby anyway. I'm so sorry, honey, I'm so sorry. No way. It can't be. Sharon was hysterical. The attending physician came running into the room. What have you done? The elderly surgeon glared angrily at Ryan while trying to hold the convulsing woman. Who gave you permission to tell your patient such news when she was on the verge of death? Leave this room immediately. Nurse, hurry up and get me a sedative. The doctor turned to the nurse, who ran to the nurse at the same moment. It would have been better to say it right away, Ryan said grimly, struggling to rise from his chair. It would have hurt more later. The surgeon looked at him for a moment, then shook his head sternly. I understand you're both in shock. But that didn't give you the right to risk your wife's health like that. Ryan seemed to ignore what the surgeon had said. He looked at the unfolding picture with a sense of utter hopelessness. His beloved had almost died and lost a child. And he, an emergency worker, couldn't prevent it. Sharon, I'll come back tomorrow, his husband said with tears in his eyes and left the room. The hardest part for Sharon was just ahead. After a long and painful recovery, the doctor announced a disappointing verdict. Because of her injuries, she would never be able to have children again. The young woman was absolutely devastated. After arriving home, Sharon could not remember what had happened in those moments around her. All the days merged into one hopelessly gray streak. Ryan tried to somehow reach out to his wife, to bring her out of this comatose state. But it was no use. The parents, as depressed by their daughter's condition as her husband, also tried to talk to Sharon, but she was completely unresponsive. No one but Ryan and her family knew how hard it was for Sharon to get up in the morning every day to get back to at least a semblance of her old self. It wasn't until almost a year later that she was able to consciously perceive her surroundings again. The pain of losing the baby was still too fresh to completely forget the experience. The woman's stomach was now forever imprinted with the marks of that horrific evening. Sharon hid the scars under dark, tight clothing. She could no longer wear a swimsuit or a light summer dress. She kept feeling like strangers would stare at her gruesome cuts. Even with Ryan, she now acted cold and reserved. And by no means did that mean she blamed him for what had happened. But she knew the anguish he must have felt, and she no longer thought their love was appropriate. At least not until the whole story had finally dissolved into the daily routine of life as it went on. To recover and distract herself from the inevitable longing, Sharon went back to work, even though it was unbearably painful to look at other people's children every day. More and more often she found herself thinking that little by little, a little at a time, she was getting better. The pain was slowly receding to the very bottom of her soul, leaving only a calmness bordering on indifference. That had been Sharon's salvation to begin with. And then when she found herself in a state where she had just found stable ground beneath her feet, her whole world fell apart again into tiny pieces from which she could no longer reassemble anything. It had been exactly 3 years ago, the the year before Sharon had finally moved to Yale Chio. Ryan had gone on a business trip somewhere up north, to Siberia. There were terrible fires there that year, and Sharon's husband was called together with other emergency workers to extinguish the fire on helicopters by dropping a special extinguishing compound. The worst thing, in what all the time after that Sharon blamed herself, is that she felt exactly nothing. Calmly let her beloved husband, the only person she had ever known, go on that damned business trip. 2 days after Ryan left, she got a call from an unknown number. "Hello," Sharon Clark said, an unfamiliar male voice. "Yes, it's me. Who am I speaking to?" "This is Captain Leo Stone of the emergency response team. Your husband, Ryan Clark." Sharon's heart immediately dropped into her stomach. It made it hard to think, not just to speak. "Yes," the woman said softly. "Sharon, be strong. Your husband died heroically while fighting a fire in the woods." Sharon felt the floor beneath her begin to move slowly away from her. Grasping the edge of the table to keep from falling, The pediatrician interjected. "So how is it dead?" "No, there must be some mistake. He's only been gone 2 days." "I'm sorry," the captain said a little more gently. "Your husband's helicopter got into a difficult situation. One of its blades failed, and then the whole apparatus fell into the river. We found the body of one of the pilots at once, but your husband must have been carried down the river by the current. Our divers are already checking the area." Something inside Sharon twitched weakly. Maybe it was the last strings of her nerves. "Wait, are you saying that Ryan's body hasn't been found yet? Wait, but that could mean he had a chance. Maybe he's still alive. Maybe he's washed ashore somewhere and needs help." There was a sad sigh from the phone. "If only it were that easy," Sharon Leo answered her. "There was a lot of height from which they fell. Plus the damage to the helicopter is such that, in general, if I were you, I would not have any illusions. But our team is doing everything necessary to comb the area as efficiently as possible." Sharon answered the captain coldly and firmly. "Luckily, Captain, you're not in my shoes and you're not likely to ever be. I'll be on the first flight as soon as possible. I want to be personally involved in the search for my husband." "I suppose so, Sharon, but you don't need all this. I promise you," Leo warned her paternally. But the lifeguard's wife was a stubborn person when it came to keeping her family together. "Let me decide for myself what I do and what I don't want to do. Captain, give me the address. I'll be there." Having warned her parents and superiors, the woman went into the heart of the taiga with members of the search and rescue team. Sharon searched the forests, but there was no sign of Ryan. "I told you you'd only be wasting your breath with this," Captain Stone lamented Sharon's arrival. "We haven't accomplished anything anyway," Sharon told the captain. "No," Sharon told him firmly. "My husband will be considered missing until you find his body. Only then will I accept that he's dead. Until then, you must keep searching as long as you can." An exhausted Sharon returned to New York. The search for her husband continued for several more months, but all was in vain. Finally, the woman came to a difficult decision to abandon everything in the capital and move permanently to a remote taiga village. That's exactly what Jilburi turned out to be. "Daughter, think about it," Brenda begged her, depressed by the situation. "I understand your grief over losing Ryan. He'll always be in your heart. But you don't just want to leave your job and your home. You want to leave us?" Sharon's elderly mother was struggling to hold back tears. "Mom, I'm sorry, but this is the only thing I really need right now," the pediatrician explained to her. "I can't stay here anymore. It reminds me of how much he and I had, how much we had in common and how much we lost." Brenda looked at her daughter with an attentive, understanding gaze. "Promise to write to me," at least her mother asked with a pleading tone in her voice. "Of course I will, Mommy," she said, hugging the older woman and assuring her daughter. "I'll write as soon as I get settled in. I'll write right away. I have already agreed with the local hospital. They take me immediately on specialty. Can you imagine? The staff there is very small. Only 10 people. So you don't have to worry about rumors about me." "Oh, honey. Rumors are so infectious," Brenda said, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. If you don't want to, they'll come out of thin air. You're new to them, so they won't trust you at first. They'll look at you. You just have to be patient, see if you can fit into their way of life. Just write to me, sweetheart, and don't forget your mother and father." Sharon hugged her mother fondly and promised her that she would be all right. The next morning she was already sitting in the airplane carrying her to the distant, uncharted Siberian lands. Sharon had made 3 transfers to Joelbury, 2 of which were by small private helicopter and 1 by an old, half-decayed bus. One thing Sharon kept carefully hidden, even from herself. She hoped to move to the remote taiga and become at least a small microscopic part closer to her missing husband. When Sharon woke up the next morning, after a heavy night of dreams mixed with memories, her head ached so badly that she didn't know where to put herself. After taking 2 painkillers, Sharon made her way to her medical station, hoping that the fresh air and the sense of forest herbs would cheer her up a bit. As soon as she was deep into her paperwork, however, Charlotte Karen, the milkmaid, burst into her office. "Sharon, you've got all the hope in the world," Charlotte said, out of breath. "Charlotte, what's wrong? Calm down, take a breath. Would you like some water?" "I don't have time for this," the blonde waved her hand at her, panting. "Are we going?" Sharon didn't understand. "Kyla, our witch doctor Michelle's granddaughter, is not doing well. I was at their house in the woods the other day." Charlotte circled the space around her uncertainly. "So Kayla was already withering away before my eyes. And this morning her grandmother Michelle told her to call her doctor. Well, my potions aren't working." Sharon had heard something about Michelle, the village witch doctor, an old woman who was rumored to be over 100 years old. She rarely showed up in the village, preferring to buy food and things through the locals. Sharon didn't approve of the women going to the witch doctor, but there was nothing she could do about it. They had been accustomed to consulting the witch since they were little girls. The only thing Sharon hoped was that they would be smart enough not to entrust their lives and the lives of their young children to the witch doctor's potions. Not too long ago, though, there was a rumor in the village that Michelle had a granddaughter. However, no matter how many times Sharon herself tried to get to her to check on the baby, she could not find the old witch's hut in the woods. And Michelle's daughter Pamela flatly refused to see a doctor. She and her grandmother, in principle, as Sharon realized, were against modern technology and medicine. But they brought the child down with their herbs. Sharon exclaimed excitedly and immediately got ready to leave. "Kayla, how old is she?" "She looks like she's just a baby." "About a year old, maybe 2, Charlotte said after a moment's thought. "She's a baby," Sharon said, shaking her head. "Charlotte, can you take me that way or to their house? I keep getting lost whenever I go there." Charlotte looked at the pediatrician strangely, then muttered quietly, "It's strange, children shouldn't go there." She added louder, "Unless Michelle herself didn't give you a pass." "Okay, but follow me. Follow the trail. The terrain there is swampy. It's easy to stumble," the milkmaid replied. In half an hour, the 2 women were already walking in the impenetrable forest. Charlotte walked lightly and briskly, almost flying over the roots and sharp branches that seemed to avoid the villager. For Sharon, however, the journey had become a living hell. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, where the witch's neat hut stood, Sharon felt like a squeezed lemon and scratched from the trees and shrubs. "Here we are," Charlotte said, pointing to the witch doctor's house. "If you will excuse me, I will go home. I have 1,000 chores to do." "Of course you do," Sharon nodded. "Thank you for your help. It's amazing how I couldn't find their house all this time. It didn't seem that far away, but every time I did, it was like I'd lost my way." Charlotte eyed Sharon a little suspiciously. Why didn't the old witch let her go to her house? Maybe she thought it was the right thing to do, she said on the way back. Maybe she sensed some kind of competition from her. Sharon was a doctor, after all. A real one. Michelle and Pamela never liked doctors. Sharon, left alone, hurried up to the porch of the hut and knocked quietly on the open door. There was no answer. Then she decided to go inside herself without invitation. The atmosphere inside was mystical. It was as if Sharon was visiting Baba Yaga herself. Everywhere hung bundles of various herbs, jars with incomprehensible potions, and a pungent aroma of juniper and spruce needles. The young woman went into the living room, hoping that the sick child was lying here somewhere. The room was rather ascetic: an old oak table, a couple of chairs, kerosene lamps, a chest of drawers, and a couple of framed photographs. One of them showed a certain girl in a dress similar to the ones used for burning the pancake effigy in spring. She stood in an embrace with a very old, wrinkled, like dried olives, woman. Apparently that was who Michelle and her daughter Pamela were. My God, how old is Pamela then, thought to herself an amazed Sharon. If it's true that her mother is 100 years old, then this woman is definitely a witch. She managed to have a baby too. Sharon put the picture back and looked at the second picture. And that's when her inside snapped. "What are you doing here?" came from behind her in a chastening old man's voice. "If it were up to me, you'd be wandering in the swamps like this. Yes, it seems that now the situation is desperate. The taiga itself let you come to me." Sharon slowly turned to the witch doctor, meeting the gaze of her unkind black eyes like the eyes of a raven. Michelle was very petite, less than half Sharon's height, but she looked very determined and a little hostile. "Where did you get that?" Sharon asked, pointing to the second picture, where her Ryan stood with a bushy beard and long hair down. Sure, he'd changed a lot in appearance, more rugged, and his eyes were unkind. But it was definitely him. "You put that back," the old woman said. "It's not yours. It's not worth looking at." Sharon's lips quivered and her knees went weak, as wobbly as when she had tried to escape from the bandit. "I'm not doing anything until you tell me where you got that picture," Sharon almost shouted in the witch doctor's face. The woman tightened her immortal, dry lips a little. Then she answered, "You'd better ask him. Will you see him soon? Did he follow you into town too? We just missed each other. You know, that's your fate." Michelle sighed heavily and then asked with pressure, "So you're going to treat my child or not? What did I call you here for?" Sharon woke up as if from a long sleep. She was trembling inside. "Show me your granddaughter," the doctor nodded and followed her into a small room, the vault of which was even lower than the living room. Here in a tiny crib lay a pale little girl. Only her cheeks burned with an unusually bright blush. "Is that Kayla?" Sharon asked. "Take care of her right away," Michelle replied. "She's been getting worse since the third day. I don't know why my potions aren't working." "Yes, do you realize that your granddaughter has pneumonia?" Sharon asked her loudly, her eyes glittering. "The girl needs to be hospitalized immediately. Thank God Charlotte brought me to you. If you had, you would have lost the baby. Do you realize that?" The witch doctor's face crinkled like she'd taken a bite out of a sour apple. "Don't burn like that, do you understand?" The old woman replied obediently. "No, I'm just wondering where her mother is," Sharon asked, looking angrily at the old woman. "No, you should have let it go like that. All we have to do now is put her on a drip and pray for Kayla to come to her senses," Michelle said. The baby made a faint sound under the pediatrician's hands. "My God, she's burning up," the woman said, and pulled a syringe and a vial of medicine out of her case. "What are you going to inject her with?" Michelle asked, looking at the ampoule incredulously. "I won't let you operate on my granddaughter." And the herbalist blocked Sharon's access to the crib. "Calm down. This is the standard antipyretic used in such cases," Sharon replied, looking confidently into Michelle's eyes. The old woman hesitated, but still stepped back, allowing her granddaughter to be injected. "She should feel better now," Sharon said and looked at the witch doctor. "What are the normal words?" "You know, emergency? I need my granddaughter." "And how do I know what's in your heads, the newcomers?" asked her indignant tone witch doctor. "My adopted daughter went into the woods on the third day and never came back. Maybe it was your co-workers who took her for experiments. My girl, where are you now?" In the next moment, large tears rolled from Michelle's eyes. Sharon realized that the woman was no longer quite sane, and it would be better if she took the girl with her to the hospital. Behind all these thoughts, the pediatrician almost forgot the mysterious photo she saw at the old lady in the living room. However, in the next minute, the solution to this mystery appeared to her in person. "Doctor, is she all right?" Ryan asked with undisguised concern in his voice. I called the elevator, but I almost fainted. I begged her to let me get a real doctor down here. Sharon turned cautiously toward the man, trying not to faint herself. Her lost spouse was standing right in front of her, looking exactly as he had in that photograph. Ryan, she said, pale as a sheet. Sharon, tell me it's true. Are you imagining things? The man stared at her for a moment, uncomprehending. Then a spark of recognition flashed in his eyes, and then he grabbed the door to keep from collapsing to the floor. Memories rained down on his brain like a snowstorm. Bill, what are you doing? Old Michelle looked from Sharon to Ryan and back again. Haven't you ever seen our village doctor? Why not? Is she the one who calls you Ryan? So that was your name in your previous life? Then Michelle scrutinized Sharon, and only after that she said with dislike, so it was you he called then in a fever. And I wondered why I didn't like you so much at once. How did I feel that you were connected? I just didn't realize it was so close that it stretched across the country. Sharon, honey, it's me, Ryan. You're seeing things right, honey. How could I have forgotten? In spite of the distance between them, Ryan took 2 wide strides to his weeping wife and squeezed her in a tight embrace. I knew you were alive, Ryan. I talked to you every night, prayed for you, felt that you hadn't crashed in the helicopter. But who did? What do you care about Michelle and Pamela? And how did you end up here? Her husband looked at her with anxiety, but with boundless love, then said, I will tell you everything for sure. Only please, let's first take my daughter to the hospital. I'm very worried about her condition. Daughter? Sharon said in amazement and pulled away from Ryan. Pamela had a baby with you? There was a moment of tense silence between the couple, but then Sharon managed to pull herself together and said, somewhat dryly, yes, you're right, the child's life comes first. Taking the girl in his arms, the man hurried out of the hut. He easily led Sharon out of the woods and back to the village and carried his daughter directly to the hospital. When Kayla had been given all the help she needed and Sharon was sure that the little girl's life was no longer in danger, she sank tiredly onto the small couch in her office. We can talk, Ryan said softly as he walked in. Sharon looked up at him, her eyes red with worry and tears. Do we have anything else to talk about? She asked in a colorless voice. The man walked carefully into the office and locked the door behind him. Sharon, I have so much to tell you, he began. But before I do, I want to assure you that if I could remember a single day of our life together, I would have come straight back to New York, I promise you. The woman smiled sadly in return. I guess you had such a good time here that you didn't even have to remember anything. Nothing stirred in your soul while you were hiding with those forest witches. Her husband grabbed her hands and forced her to face him. No, Sharon, you've got it all wrong. I just couldn't remember anything. You know I couldn't. And Ryan began his sad story. I was blown into the river by a shockwave. I don't really remember how it happened. I just felt a strong jolt and a few seconds of free fall, and then cold and pain, when Michelle found me on the shore. I was badly mangled and unconscious. She and her daughter Pamela managed to drag me to her hut. And there, the man sighed nervously. There I spent the next 6 months, barely regaining consciousness. Those women cured me, no matter what anyone says. Some of their potions have incredible healing powers. I don't know, maybe it was something like a coma, except when I finally woke up, I was a blank slate, you know? I didn't even remember my name, didn't know who I was. Ryan rubbed the bridge of his nose, as if he wanted to erase from his memory all the terrible things that had happened to him. Sharon listened without interrupting. She wanted to know the whole truth from him, all the way to the end. I've been relearning how to walk. There's something wrong with my back, because I can't always keep my balance. But that's okay as long as you don't try to run too fast or carry too heavy a load. Pamela has been with me from the beginning. She nursed me, spoon-fed me. She brought me back to life. I'm sorry, but it's true. A bitter grin appeared on Sharon's face. How touching. The woman silently admitted to herself that she was overcome with jealousy. And then I started walking again solely because I had completely lost my memory. I decided to stay here for a while until I remembered who I was, and if I had a family. Naturally, I helped the women with their chores and hunted. But I did all that without leaving the woods, you know. Michelle led me to believe that I might be a fugitive. And then the police station would probably have an APB out on me. Ryan tried to explain to his wife. There was Sharon responded resignedly. Only the APB had you listed as a missing person. Sharon covered her face with her hands, unable to take in all this information. God, I've been looking for you for so long. I'm alive, Ryan replied firmly. I'm alive and I'm sitting here trying to explain everything to you. How do you explain your daughter? His wife brought him to the point. Ryan looked off into the distance, and for a moment he was transported into his own thoughts. I love Kyla very much, and I want to take her with me when this is over and she's fully recovered. It was a moment of weakness. Sharon, you have to understand, I didn't remember anything at all, and Michelle was so good to me. When she told me she was pregnant, I knew that whatever happened, I would take care of my daughter. His spouse turned away. She didn't want Ryan to see her face right now. Except Pamela was gone. Karen? The woman didn't understand. Pamela's gone. Remember when Michelle said she'd gone into the woods and hadn't been home in 3 days? Well, I found her today. What's wrong with her? Sharon whispered with a bad feeling. She's dead, Ryan replied shortly. Oh my God, Sharon exclaimed, clamping her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. How did this happen? Her husband rubbed his palms, sweating with fear. Sharon had never seen him so frightened. I guess she went to pick herbs and berries. Anyway, it was a bear. I only recognized her by her dress, her basket. Sharon felt her feet go cold. Michelle, are you going? Ryan only shook his head. I suspected she'd already figured it out. She'd rather think her daughter drowned in the swamp than have me tell her such a terrible truth. They have a slightly different concept of death here. I buried Sabrina there, in the forest, so Michelle, God willing, will not stumble upon her. The taiga gives and takes back. Michelle said she found Sabrina as a lonely teenager. She was supposedly hiding in the woods from her stepfather. So she took her in. You don't regret her? She was a really nice person, Ryan said quietly. What can I do now that I found out about her like that? Sharon felt shame burning inside her. Alas, it was only after the news of Pamela's death that she had been able to see her as the person who had saved her husband's life, not as an insidious rival. Sharon? Ryan asked her quietly. Can we get out of here as soon as Kayla's better? We will. You can forgive me, right? Sharon looked into her husband's blue eyes and made the only decision she could make. Of course, Ryan. I'm still your wife, and I'll always be your wife. And so it was. As soon as little Kayla recovered, Ryan and Sharon quickly packed for the road and were ready to take a bus that evening to the nearest airport, where they could be flown to the mainland by helicopter. And then they could take a regular airplane to New York City. Ryan wanted to go to say goodbye to Susan as he was stunned by Charlotte's tragic news. It turns out that the old healer was gone the night before. Apparently could not survive the disappearance of her daughter, suggested the milkmaid then, and no one knew exactly how old Michelle was. Sharon even wept when she learned of the old woman's death. No matter how she felt about her and her unconventional methods of treatment, she never wished her a similar fate. Don't worry, Charlotte assured her. We'll give her a proper Christian burial. The pediatrician thanked the kind countrywoman, and after saying goodbye to everyone except Vincent's annoying paramedic, left with her husband and Kayla back to the capital. When they returned home, the first thing they did was to officially adopt little Kayla and restore all of Ryan's papers. Sharon's parents were happy to learn that their son-in-law was alive after all. They threw a big party for the occasion, and Kayla became the long-awaited granddaughter who came to them almost 10 years after their daughter's wedding. Ryan went back to work and rescue, but due to an injury he could no longer work in the field, so he went back to where he once started. He now counsels and trains young lifeguards. Now he is full of strength and energy, and wants to make his life more calm and measured, directing most of his time to raising his daughter and his beloved wife. Sharon, on the other hand, continued her work at the clinic. Returning to her former duties, she, as before, treats children. Only now she has her own little daughter waiting for her at home, whom she loves more than life, and for whom she thanks God every day. So, having gone through a series of difficult trials, the Clark family finally found a second chance for happiness. And this time they are not going to miss it. Barbara worked as an editor at a publishing house. On another Thursday, just before lunchtime, her smartphone started ringing. On the screen she saw the words "Mom." Although calls during work were not a frequent occurrence, Barbara didn't expect anything bad. She figured her mom just missed her or wanted advice on clothing choices. Barbara answered the phone. As soon as she heard her mom's voice, she immediately knew something was wrong. The voice was strange, muffled. "Barbara, honey, don't worry, please," Mom said. "I'm at the hospital right now." "Mommy, what happened? What hospital are you in? What did the doctors say? What do you need to bring? What's the room number?" Barbara asked her questions. "Barbara, please don't worry," the voice answered. "It's just like in the movie. I slipped and fell and was passed out. But I'm fine." Gabriella, a neighbor, was walking by. She helped me and supported me while we waited for the ambulance. The doctor said I'd be fine, but I'd be in the hospital for a while. "Mom, why didn't you tell me before? Mom, why didn't you tell me? I would have rushed to help." "I didn't want to interrupt you in the middle of the day. Mom, but tonight 4 to 7 p.m. is visiting hours. I was afraid if you went home first, then to the pharmacy, you might not make it. Please write down what you need to bring. The main things are a policy, a cell phone charger, and non-carbonated water. For some reason I'm very thirsty." Her mother sighed, and Barbara imagined her face contorted with pain. She hurried to end the conversation by asking for the number of the hospital and the room. Barbara reread the list of things her mother had dictated to her. Yes, Barbara had peed chicken broth in it and used wet wipes. And on wobbly legs she went to ask her boss, Jack. "Please allow me to leave early today, for personal reasons. My mom's in the hospital," Barbara said. The boss, a friend of Barbara's husband's from his student days, expressed polite words of sympathy. When he learned which hospital the subordinate's mother was in, he cheered her up and asked, "But the doctors at our regional clinic are good. Maybe the atmosphere is not too luxurious, but the equipment and staff are top-notch. I've been in this hospital several times. I was discharged as good as new. So you're going to be fine. By the way, are you driving today, or is Matthew driving? Maybe Eden can give you a ride in the car." Barbara was touched by her boss's concern and decided that she was in no position to refuse. "Thank you, Jack. That would be very helpful. I'm not keeping the driver long. I just need to get to my mom's house, that's all. I won't keep Eden any longer. I'll get my things there and then call a cab. Thank you." The manager wished Barbara success and promised, "Come out in 15 minutes to the main entrance. I'll tell Eden to wait for you at your mother's house and give you a ride to your family home. He's coming back for me anyway. Is your house on the way?" Thanking her sensitive boss again, Barbara went to turn off her computer and clean up her workplace. She took the contract with her so that she wouldn't let the whole team down and complete the necessary work by the next morning. The woman badly perceived the meaning of the jokes with which the driver tried to entertain her, but even she was grateful that the flow of his speeches made her at least react somehow and prevented her from sinking into anxious thoughts. Following the list, ticking off each recorded item with a check mark, Barbara packed up her mother's apartment, watering her favorite flowers. She shut off the gas and water just in case, checked to make sure there were no perishables in the refrigerator, picked up the trash to throw out. Only then did Barbara go downstairs and set off with her driver, Eden. Not far from Barbara and Matthew's house was a supermarket with a pharmacy department inside. The woman decided to stop there on the way, asking Eden to pull over near the container yard. She threw out the garbage she had collected and rushed to get her groceries. Moving almost on autopilot, Barbara bought everything she needed and was soon preparing dinner for her husband and broth for her mother at the same time. While the food was boiling and baking, she called Matthew and explained the situation. "Matthew, Mom is in the hospital. I'm going to go see her. I'm not sure how long she'll be there. Dinner will be on the stove." My husband replied, "I'm aware of that. Jack told me you needed support. You wait for me, I'll try to get there early, and we'll go to the hospital together. See if there's anything else you need, and I'll be there for you." Matthew didn't let his wife down and took her and the 2 bags she had packed and drove her to the hospital. Barbara managed to persuade the nurse taking the bags to let her see her mother and the doctor, who was fortunately there. Matthew remained waiting for his wife in the lobby, but gave her kind words and wishes for a speedy recovery. Audrey tried to smile when she saw Barbara enter the room, but it was noticeable that she was uncomfortable and frightened. Barbara said a soft but distinctive hello to everyone in the room and made her way to her mother's bedside. A weight was suspended from the unfortunate woman's right leg. Her lips, swollen almost to the point of bleeding, were a clear indication that the victim of the ice had been in great pain. Barbara listened to her mother's account of her accident and, trying not to cry, began to put everything she had brought into the nightstand. The phone was immediately put on charge. She gave her mother tea with jam, broth, made her eat a few spoonfuls of raw, grated carrots. The internet says that such a salad in the first days after injury the best vitamin remedy. Then I'll give you some sauerkraut. It's good for you, too, Barbara said. Oh, don't worry, my daughter. You should probably go home, Matthew. He's probably worried you're gone, Audrey said. Barbara explained that her husband had rushed home when he heard what had happened so she wouldn't have to take a cab, but he hadn't been missed. But he said hello, as if he'd just been waiting for that line. The woman lying in the next bed became active. "Sanitarians, nurses here are rude, boorish women. And you interfere in the conversation. It is impossible to call them neither day nor night. They serve teas, make fun of doctors, give chocolates. Even giving them money is useless. They're not even doing their job properly anyway." Barbara kept silent, and having found out from her mother the name and patronymic of her attending doctor, went in search of him. The restless neighbor also made a good point. In the residence room, if not, then in the dressing room, looked there, probably with someone cooing keen. Thanking the nagging woman dryly, Barbara went out into the corridor. The nurses in the trauma room, accustomed to all sorts of relatives, tears and hysterics, looked at the visitor, asking how to find a doctor with a mixture of irritation and fatigue. But one of them, who held herself like a superior, answered thoroughly. "Patrick is now in the superintendent's office, the penultimate door at that end of the corridor. Wait there. Or you can sit on the bench near the residence room." Barbara waited for the doctor, and he recognized her as Audrey's daughter. He invited her into the office, showing her the picture on the computer screen. "If I may say so, your mother's fracture was a success," Patrick explained. "In general, there are 2 treatment options." The man began to explain the nuances of each option, then asked, "Which one did you decide on?" Barbara looked the doctor in the eyes, but did not answer, but asked a counter question. "Say, Patrick, for example, if a patient with the same fracture as my mom had a loved one, what would you recommend?" Smiling, the doctor replied briefly, "A similar case was with my aunt. Our superintendent performed a similar operation on her a year ago, and as she now leads an active life, even works at the cottage, so I cannot keep up with her." The woman clarified all the details of the upcoming surgery, wrote down what else should be brought for the postoperative period, and having said goodbye to the doctor, left the office. Barbara had to announce to her mother that the surgery was scheduled for the next day, and she presented the news as lightly as possible, trying not to disturb her mother. "Tomorrow I'll go and meet you. You'll be fine after the operation, don't worry." "Barbara, what about your job?" "The boss is probably going to be mad," Audrey asked. "Don't worry about that. I'll do all the work and I won't let you or the chief down." With the surgery, the long road to getting Audrey walking again had just begun. For 2 weeks, Barbara visited her mother almost daily to feed and nurse her. The woman tried to object and repeatedly stated, "Barbara, you take care of yourself. Don't come to see me so often. The food here is not bad, and I have no appetite." Where would it come from if my energy is not used for anything? But Audrey couldn't change her daughter's mind. When the day of discharge arrived, Barbara went to the doctor's office for recommendations. Patrick was cautious and warned. Your mom is a very energetic lady, but I've made my point, and I'll make it to you again. I wouldn't be overly optimistic if I were you. But there's no need to despair, although you can't use your injured limb for full weight bearing. Crutches are your mom's best friend for the next month. And then you have to be careful too. Of course, it is necessary to move, but carefully. Prophylactic treatments are indicated to prevent bed sores. In 6 weeks, I'll be waiting for a follow-up X-ray. We'll see what stage of fusion the bone will be in. That's pretty much it. Barbara asked. Maybe some vitamins for Mom to take? Patrick shrugged. Well, in principle you could, but in general you should be told about the rehabilitation plan at the polyclinic where you live. Barbara called a special cab specializing in the transportation of people with limited mobility, and after a heroic trek through the streets, Audrey was finally in her apartment. Barbara faced a new problem. Audrey's physical condition still left much to be desired. Even a simple trip to the restroom or kitchen could result in a new injury. At first, Barbara came to Audrey's house twice a day, and closer to the New Year's holidays, she was practically exhausted. The traffic jams were so time-consuming that there were only a few hours left for sleep. Barbara turned to her husband. Matthew, let's let Mom stay with us for a while. At least I won't have to go back and forth between apartments. The man answered grimly, and after a quick pause, Barbara, I feel wonderful about your mother. Audrey is a wonderful woman, but I'm sorry. But I'm going to be blunt, we have nowhere to put her here. I mean, it's a studio apartment. It's a big room, but there's only one room. When I talked you into taking out a mortgage, I didn't get any sympathy. Both you and your mom were against it. Matthew, there's got to be some kind of a screen. It'd be like having 2 rooms. Look, but Audrey would be the first thing that would be uncomfortable. I play computer games loudly. I listen to music all night. Besides, you should ask her if she'd be willing to move. I'm 100% sure she'll say no. Your mom is very tactful and wise and realizes that the further away she lives, the better her relationship with her son-in-law will be. Matthew turns out to be right. Audrey, having barely heard the idea of moving into her son-in-law and daughter's apartment, only exclaimed indignantly, "There can't even be a conversation. At home and the walls help. I will not go to your place, especially there, and it will be inconvenient to be sick in peace." Barbara obeyed her mother's will. She didn't want to argue with her husband. She continued to waste time standing in traffic and left the place of a lawyer in Jack's firm. With the permission of her boss, Barbara transferred to a half-time position and was very glad that the manager was able to meet her needs. She prepared the contracts during the visit and trained her smart girl, and diligently performed all the duties that did not require constant presence in the office. The rehab, however, took a lot more money than the woman had realized. Sometimes she shared with her husband her indignation at the fact that pharmacies changed prices at will and tried to sell the most expensive version of a drug. And then Matthew would grumble. "Look, Barbara, your mother must have some free medication." The woman tried not to answer. After all, the family budget did not suffer, and money from her husband for almost 6 months since the fateful news of her mother's troubles, she did not ask. Barbara had generally tried to handle the situation on her own, without Matthew's interference. The weather was changing. Barbara's schedule remained almost unchanged by the tradition that had formed. In the morning she would make her husband breakfast and, if she had time, make preparations for lunch and dinner. Then, after putting some of the breakfast in containers, she would rush to her mother's house, stopping at stores and pharmacies along the way. Taking care of her, keeping her spirits up, and helping her move around the apartment took a lot of time. Barbara would then run to the office and rush home by evening in case of any emergencies. Her neighbor, the same Gabriella who had helped her wait for the ambulance, had the key to her mother's apartment. She would sometimes drop by to watch TV and gossip together, so Audrey couldn't be called abandoned. But Barbara was desperate to get her mom back on her feet, and not just because she had to spend a lot of time traveling between very distant parts of the city every day, without weekends and holidays. It was just that Mom was the closest person to her. She had, in fact, given Barbara life twice. The first time was on her birthday 38 years ago, but more importantly later when a terrible tragedy struck Barbara in a terrible avalanche. It was her mother who was there for her in those black days, helped her to move around when her legs almost collapsed due to nervousness, forced her to drink and eat, then by persuasion, then by force. Abandoning her monetary and not dusty work, my mother sold the apartment in their hometown and, almost as a huge and clumsy cule, moved it 2,000 kilometers away from the place where everything Barbara reminded her of her inhuman grief. It was Audrey who had forced her to take a job where it was almost impossible to be alone with her sad thoughts, where she had to look stylish and trim. Barbara did not consider her help to her mother as self-sacrifice and, despite her fatigue, tried to surround her husband with care. Moreover, the 10-year wedding anniversary was approaching, and the woman wanted to organize a touching congratulation and a pleasant surprise for patient Matthew. She made a preliminary version of the menu in advance. She found a confectionery where orders were made on individual designs and agreed to prepare an unusual figurative cake for her husband. "I love his sweets," Barbara said. The holiday was approaching, but shortly before it arrived, Matthew, during his morning breakfast, warned. "Sorry, Barbara, but I need a car for a few days. I have to go to the branch office in the neighboring region, because something seems to be going on there with the branch manager's reports. Profits are down by leaps and bounds. Although in other divisions everything is even. And in some places even growth is observed. Of course I'll try to make a quick trip, but airplanes are unlikely to fly in those parts. And I don't feel like taking the train. Can you manage without a car?" Although Barbara herself was counting on the faithful family horse, she didn't argue. After all, her husband really needed the car more. She smiled. "I'll manage, of course." Matthew thanked her politely for breakfast and promised, "Nothing, we'll buy you an iron horse a little later. The situation at work will normalize, and you'll choose a model." Running out of the house, the man kissed his wife on the cheek, winked and said, "Don't worry, I remember our wedding anniversary. I'll try to be there Friday night." Taking advantage of her husband's absence, Barbara moved to her mother's house for a while, so as not to waste time on the road. During these few days she had time to do a general cleaning, and the apartment was somehow especially fresh in spring. Only on the eve of the holiday Barbara had to return home. To bring to the office, she urgently needed a diploma. However, it was even better, because she had to clean up the house and prepare some of Matthew's favorite salads. In the morning, the woman took the holiday treats that had been put aside in separate containers and rushed to her mother's house. She habitually gave her a massage, helped her walk around her room, and even after waiting for the elevator repairs to be completed, finally took her mother outside so she could rejoice in the nice weather and enjoy the feeling of life returning to the way it was before the injury. After a short walk, Audrey and Barbara had lunch, and the daughter began to apologize. "Mommy, you'll have to excuse me, please. I'm going to leave early today. I want to surprise Matthew. Turn off the TV when you get bored. Your cell phone's charged. Call me if you need anything, okay?" "Run, Barbara. Happy holidays and cheers." Wow, 10 years together. She kissed her mom and Barbara ran along the route she'd planned. Spring, which had long ago entered its rights and was rapidly approaching summer, gave soft warmth, and the sweet and tart aroma of blossoming lilac set the mood for the most romantic mood. Contrary to popular belief that marriage in May portended trouble, she did not have to suffer in her second marriage. On the contrary, Matthew was for a woman a safe haven. There were no violent passions between them, but there was mutual sympathy and respect. Barbara appreciated her husband for the fact that he did not pry into her soul, did not pester her with jealousy and suspicion, did not demand to give birth to an heir or heiress. It was only when he announced his serious intentions that Barbara warned him directly and honestly that children were not part of her plans. The man was not frightened by this statement. A few years after the wedding, Matthew asked if she had changed her mind about the child. But having heard a categorical no, did not begin to find out the reasons and did not raise this topic again. The man was a good partner, and of course she loved him in her own way, with all the strength her wounded heart was capable of. Following the list she'd made the day before, Barbara bought drinks, picked up the calamari Matthew adored. And so she bought little things: a crusty baguette, fresh green salad, fruit. The 2 large shopping bags that Barbara had thoughtfully brought with her were gradually filling up. Having hung them on both shoulders, she ran into the pastry shop where she had ordered a cake. Now it was time to go home. As she approached the driveway, Barbara looked hopefully at the family parking space and breathed a sigh of relief there was no car. So she would have time to set the table, hang the balloons, and dress up before her husband returned. Praising herself mentally for the handy bags, thanks to which one hand was free, the woman hurriedly opened the door and finally found herself in the family nest. Placing the box with the cake on the banquet, Barbara suddenly froze with surprise. The familiar hum of a residential apartment building was brazenly interfered with by a foreign sound coming from the kitchen. Strangely, there were no foreign shoes on the mat. There were no foreign things visible, but the clatter of dishes came to her quite clearly, as if someone had moved a massive plate or a bulky mug. Matthew and Barbara kept no pets. All they wanted was a cute dog. An unfortunate accident with their mom had tweaked that plan. It probably would have been much smarter to go out to the playground, close the door, and call her husband. But from fatigue, Barbara didn't act as safety dictated. Automatically pulling her sneakers off her feet, and with her bag squarely on her shoulders, the woman walked into the kitchen and nearly collapsed with surprise, tucking one leg under her. On a chair sat a boy of about 6 years of age. The unknown little guest was completely engrossed in his meal. On the table in front of him was Matthew's huge mug, a bottle of water, and a large deep plate into which Barbara had assembled the puffed salad from the evening before, so that it would have time to soak. A spoon sticking out from the edge clearly indicated that the dish had already been unceremoniously sampled. The child bit into the stick of cheese and smoked sausage with gusto, and the woman's heart clenched as the memories came flooding back. It was too painful to act rationally. For a few seconds, Barbara even thought she was hallucinating because of overwork or some other reason. However, the sight, the sound, the image, and even the aroma of the sausage were too realistic. The engrossed boy broke away from his tasty pastime only after Barbara, in a voice a little hoarse from nervous shock, caught his attention with a question. "Hello, who are you? And what are you doing here?" The boy jumped up from his chair and, without letting go of the sausage, reported. "My name is Roger. Uncle Matthew brought me here. Told him to wait here. Said I could eat whatever I wanted. So I'm eating. It's good sausage, but it's very salty." Barbara had no idea that the man the boy called Uncle Matthew wasn't her husband. There was no such incredible coincidence as in a traditional New Year's Eve movie, when the hero didn't realize he'd opened someone else's apartment with his own keys, and was completely unconcerned by the typical furnishings of a standard apartment. Barbara could safely vouch for the fact that it wasn't easy to find even a closely similar design as in her and her husband's place. Surely there must be a logical explanation for the boy's appearance in the kitchen, the woman thought. She herself, having married Matthew, had become Davies, and Roger's last name meant absolutely nothing to her. Her husband was the only child of his parents, but he had cousins, as far as Barbara knew. Except they hadn't been invited to the modest wedding, and she didn't know them by face or surname. So it was quite possible that the Roger sitting before her was the child of one of her husband's cousins. But why had he, without even warning, suddenly brought this boy to their apartment? Shaken out of her psychological equilibrium, Barbara couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she hadn't even had time to think of any plausible version when Matthew called. Coming out of her daze, Barbara finally took the bags off her shoulders and took the call. The man began to speak quickly, literally not letting his wife get a word in edgewise. "Love, you and I just missed each other by a little bit. I've just left Audrey's apartment, and I'll be there in 20 minutes to explain everything to you. Set the table." Okay, the confused woman cheered up a little and replied briefly. She felt Roger's gaze on her very clearly, but she could not find the strength to look him in the eye. The woman brought from the hallway her new slippers, just recently purchased in anticipation of the approaching summer season, and suggested, "Roger, you have sneakers. It's hot at home. Keep your flip-flops. Put them on. It will be more comfortable and convenient." The child silently obeyed. To defuse the situation and occupy the boy thrown to her, but at the same time to avoid having to talk to him a lot, Barbara asked, "Roger, do you know how to inflate balloons?" The boy nodded. The woman quickly went to the room and brought the child a whole package of balloons. Then, obeying some impulse, she licked the tips through which Roger was to inflate the balloons and handed them to him, asking, "Don't inflate too much. When you get tired, rest, and I'll help you tie them. Deal?" The child nodded dutifully and, without feeling any embarrassment, asked, "And what's your name?" "Barbara." There was silence in the kitchen. The boy, thinking about something, was busy with the marbles. Barbara kept an eye on her guest and began to sort through the bags, prepare what was planned, and gradually set the table. She put the cake in the refrigerator and, distracted by tying the inflated balloons, felt a pinch of pain rather than irritation. She wasn't angry with her husband, but her mind was spinning incessantly with all sorts of thoughts. The woman felt the curious gaze of the little guest, but did not dare to look him in the eye. So they looked at each other, but hardly spoke to each other. Barbara did not notice how Matthew came into the kitchen with a huge bouquet of roses in his hands and a large bag. The man put the bag on the floor and handed the flowers to his wife. "Barbara, congratulations to you and myself on our holiday. I see that you and Roger have already made friends. That's wonderful. Well then, let's celebrate." The boy was visibly cheerful, and after Matthew appeared, he said modestly, "Congratulations." And when everyone sat down at the table after the inevitable fuss, he boasted loudly, "Uncle Matthew, I inflated the balloons myself and Barbara helped me tie them. That's a nice surprise we got for you." The grown man mumbled something inaudible in response, praising Roger and his wife, who hadn't even touched the food. There was tension in the apartment, and Matthew set about remedying the situation. He softly turned on the music and began to enthusiastically praise the dishes his wife had prepared. Then he made a toast to Barbara's beauty and charm. He took a box out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said, "Congratulations. I hope you like it." The woman, confused in her assumptions and thoughts about why her husband had brought a child to the apartment, only now remembered her gift. Leaving the not-too-cheerful company for a while, Barbara, clutching the unopened box in the palm of her hand, took out the hidden present. Returning to the table, she handed the package to her husband and confined herself to a parsimonious phrase, "In honor of your wedding anniversary." Matthew hastily tore the wrapping paper, marveled at the pewter mug, and began to show the gift to Roger. The woman felt uncomfortable and sank back into her thoughts, not at all how she had envisioned the wedding anniversary celebration. She had wanted to prepare a surprise, but her husband had managed not only to surprise her, but to throw her completely off balance in the most natural way. Barbara coughed violently from surprise, choking on her mineral water, when she heard the question addressed to her. "Barbara, Roger's going to stay with us for a couple of weeks, okay?" Matthew said. Barbara was silent, not knowing what to say. Matthew tried to justify himself. "I stopped by Audrey's to pick you up on my way home. I wanted to explain everything to you, but I didn't have time. It was a surprise. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I was sure that I would pick you up at your mom's and tell you on the way that we had a guest." Matthew's monologue ended in a long silence. Barbara moved the food on her plate with her fork without looking up at her husband. He, confused, didn't know what else to say for himself. With childlike directness, Roger broke into the silence by asking, "Aunt Barbara, thank you. I've already eaten. Can I have some cake now?" The boy showed the empty plate, and with a stony face, Barbara got up from the chair and went to the refrigerator. She wanted to scream, stomp her feet, and sob. Her faith in her husband's honesty was shaken. But she knew it wouldn't make it any easier. The most likely explanation for Matthew's bringing Roger to the apartment seemed to be that he had been unfaithful. With all her being, Barbara now hated the man she had loved for 10 years as much as she knew how. Matthew, who knew his wife well, guessed from her impulsive movements that she would say what was on her mind. So he decided to take the little guest away from the table to a sitting area where he could distract himself from the upcoming serious adult conversation. "Roger, come on, I'll turn on the game console. True, my games are mostly complex, but we can find something to your taste on the internet, or cartoons if you want." "Are you allowed to eat cake there?" asked the boy. "Of course you can eat anything," Matthew said. The boy's eyes sparkled, and he trustingly followed the owner of the apartment to the cozy, soft corner. Barbara, having heard the conversation between her husband and the guest, cut a large piece of cake, carefully placed it on a plate, turned on the electric kettle, and carefully watched it boil. The click of the kettle turning off brought Barbara out of her reverie. She was making tea. The woman placed a cup of the delicious beverage, sugar and spoon, and a plate of cake on a tray, then carried it to a table near the play area of the apartment. Matthew was showing Roger a collection of computer games, but the boy, who was clearly well-mannered, broke away from the fascinating activity and thanked. "Thank you very much." Barbara nodded and turned and walked away. When Matthew came into the kitchen, he found Barbara sitting on the floor, holding a pair of children's sneakers. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. The man tried to make a joke. "Barbara, what's wrong with you?" A child with dirty shoes walked into the kitchen. "Now, robot vacuum cleaner, turn on, let him work." "It's no big deal. It's nothing. Why get upset over a little dust? Especially since it's a holiday." Barbara looked at her husband in a way that made him uncomfortable and said quietly, "Matthew, I think I've told you repeatedly that I don't want to be in the same space with the children for too long. It's beyond me. There must have been good reasons for what you did, or, as you put it, for the surprise. And you're understandable. But I'm sorry, I don't have the slightest desire to deal with any of this today. I'm going to go to my mother's and stay with her for a while." Matthew could not understand the reason for such a categorical decision of his wife, but he saw that Barbara was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so he suggested, "Barbara, I'm really very guilty for not warning you, but I can explain everything. I think that when you hear me out, you'll realize that I couldn't have done anything differently. I'll wait until you're ready to talk." Suddenly, the woman gently put down the children's sneakers, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and went to the door, as if she hadn't heard her husband. Matthew took his wife's hand and asked, "Barbara, wait a minute. I'll call a cab to Audrey's house so I don't have to worry about you." Barbara nodded and was soon in the cab car. She was holding her purse in her hands. The road was clear, and it took much less time to get to her mom's house than it did during peak hours. As soon as the woman opened the door, she heard, "Gabriella, come in, dear. I'm not feeling very well." Barbara closed the door behind her and went straight into her mother's bedroom. Audrey was alarmed to see her daughter. "Barbara, what are you doing back? Didn't Matthew come home? By my reckoning, your wedding anniversary celebration should be in full swing. And you're here for some reason. Daughter, what's wrong?" Barbara walked over to her mother's bed, sat down on the floor, and leaned her head against Audrey's palm and told her everything that had happened since she had come home and seen Roger there. When she had finished her story, Barbara made her suggestion. "Mom, I'm pretty sure Roger is Matthew's illegitimate son. The boy looks to be about 6 years old. So my husband cheated on me and had the nerve to show me evidence of his infidelity on our wedding anniversary." Audrey tried to reassure her daughter. "I'm sure Matthew can explain everything. I can feel that he loves you. Believe my experience, he would hardly risk his relationship with you and cheat." Barbara, however, cried without stopping. Audrey stroked her so mature but defenseless daughter, but no more words were spoken because they were all powerless. Finally, when the flow of tears dried up, Barbara silently got up from the floor and went to wash her face swollen with tears. The woman felt completely devastated. Returning to her mother's room, Barbara confessed, "I'm very tired for today, and I don't mind lying down." Audrey did not object and suggested, for example, to talk some more and have dinner. She realized that her unhappy daughter needed to rest. "Of course, Barbara, but let's get you and me something to calm you down." "Of course, Barbara. Valerian, at least. It would do you and me good." Barbara complied with her mother's request and went to bed. The nervous tension was so intense that the woman passed out and woke up when the clock read 10. She jumped up on the couch and rushed to the kitchen, where she caught Audrey's mother preparing the batter for pancakes. "Good morning, daughter. You're just in time. Are we having breakfast now?" The women made pancakes in 4 hands and, as if they were in agreement, never said a word about yesterday's situation. As Barbara was washing the dishes, Audrey asked, "Daughter, please go to the theater with Gabriella. She has 2 tickets to a very good play, great seats in the parlor. Her niece gave them to her for her birthday. They were supposed to go together. And then, as luck would have it, her niece got sick. The rest of the family can't keep Gabriella company. Some of them are called away on country plots, some are on a business trip. So the ticket's gone. It's a shame. Barbara shook her head. Mommy, I don't want to go anywhere. I'm not in the mood. However, if Audrey had something on her mind, she knew how to insist on her own. That's why you should go, because you're not in the mood. Art is great at switching thoughts in your head and changing emotions. Please, daughter, not for the sake of the missing ticket, but for me. I want to. Barbara had to comply with her mother's wish. However, she refused the offer to run to the hairdresser beforehand and get a new haircut. After waiting for Gabriella to take Barbara away, Audrey called her son-in-law and said in an almost commanding tone, Matthew, Barbara won't be here until about 3 p.m. Come over, we need to talk. The man did not resist, but warned. Audrey, I'll be there, but I don't have anyone to leave Roger with. I don't think I can find a nanny. But I wouldn't trust the boy to someone I don't know. So I can only come with him. Do you mind? The woman sighed. I don't mind. Me. Great. Then Roger and I will be at your place in half an hour. 30 minutes later, Audrey, carefully reaching the door, leaning on a walker, let Matthew and Roger into the apartment. The man introduced the child and the boy. Roger said a polite hello. Mistress Audrey tried not to betray her incredible excitement and hospitably invited Roger into the kitchen. Come in. I have a TV and cakes waiting for you. Do you want cocoa or tea? The child announced that he tastes most delicious coffee, but it is not allowed for children to drink this drink often, and he will drink tea because he is too old for cocoa. Audrey almost laughed out of surprise, but she got her emotions under control in time and, turning to Matthew, asked, Can we give Roger some tea too? And she was more like a treat. It's almost like coffee. The boy rejoiced. I want to try this drink. Matthew, may I? And Matthew said yes. As the hostess deftly prepared the treat for Roger, the man handed the boy his smartphone and explained, I need to talk to Audrey. You, please stay here. Eat the treats, play on your phone, maybe even watch some videos on the internet for a bit. Good, sure, where there are words. I'm perfectly capable of being unsupervised, don't worry. Observing this picture, Audrey could barely restrain herself from crying. Hiding her emotions, she slowly walked toward the room, which was old-fashionedly called the hall. Matthew followed her, eager to find out what Audrey wanted to talk to him about. The woman sat down in an armchair, and the man sat on a sofa across from it, so that the conversation could be carried on comfortably. The hostess looked at her son-in-law attentively, but he did not endure long and asked without preamble, Audrey, will you explain to me why Barbara reacted so inadequately to Roger's appearance in our apartment? Will I admit my guilt? If anything, I did not warn her. But we're adults. Instead of having a calm conversation, she basically just ran to you. Is that normal? The woman did not interrupt the indignant speech of her son-in-law, but his question was not in a hurry to answer, and asked a counter-question. Before I start a difficult conversation to try to help my daughter to keep the family, I need to be sure that it makes sense. Tell me the truth, Matthew. Is Roger your illegitimate son? The man's outrage was unparalleled. No, of course not. I've never thought of cheating on Barbara. I love her very much, I respect her, but her attitude towards children is starting to scare me. Roger was in our apartment because of a desperate situation. But Barbara didn't even try to get along with him. Although, as you may have noticed, he is a well-mannered, bright, and charming boy. Matthew's answer calmed the worried Audrey, and taking a deep breath, as if preparing to make a parachute jump, she decided to tell her son-in-law the truth. What is it? All things secret, as they say, come to light. As a husband, you have the right to know why my daughter avoids contact with children. I think I have the right to tell you her story, which at first seemed like a happy fairy tale, and then turned into a terrible nightmare that destroyed the usual life. Barbara grew up a wonderful and clever girl, and was a real joy for me and my husband. We had no problem to arrange her to study in one of the best gymnasiums in our city. The income of our family and the positions held by me and my husband allowed Barbara to be her own among the same, as they say, golden youth. However, the gymnasium had a very strong teaching staff, and grades were not for sale, as you might think. Children were skillfully interested in learning, and our Barbara was one of the best students in the class. She was even made a tutor for her desk mate Frank. The boy was from a very good family, quite influential in our town. His dad was a district attorney, and his mom was in the same department in the last position. In general, they lived better than our family, but they didn't hinder the development of their son's friendship with Barbara. They welcomed her wholeheartedly. They did not talk to me and my husband through the lip, but quite kindly. When Barbara was in 10th grade, her father died suddenly. A blood clot had broken, according to the autopsy. It was Frank's family that supported Barbara and me after this loss. I still thank them for that, because I was in such a state that I almost went to my husband. So of course I didn't mind at all when Barbara decided to marry Frank. So what if they were just over 18 at the time? Obviously, you can't stand in the way of real feelings. Frank's parents didn't mind either and were even happy to have my daughter as part of their family. A year after the wedding, Barbara and Frank had twins, 2 boys, Adam and Henry. Healthy, cheerful, and strong, they grew up and made us all happy. Barbara couldn't get enough of her babies. You know, Matthew, she used to tell me that she was walking, rolling the stroller in front of her, and her heart was ready to jump out of her chest every now and then. Of course, I helped whenever I could. My mother-in-law repeatedly suggested that Barbara hire a reliable nanny, but my daughter refused every time and mostly managed on her own. God knows what it cost her, but she did not give up her university studies, and even without a sabbatical leave managed to do without. And her father-in-law put her in a prestigious and well-paid job in such a position that the working day was strictly rationed. There was a social package and other benefits. He had the opportunity, of course. And he was not ashamed to patronize his daughter-in-law. Barbara was smart. When the boys were 6, my daughter became pregnant again. Frank welcomed the news with joy, and why should he? It was a wonderful family relationship. As far as I know, there's never been a fight between them. It was like the 2 halves were lucky enough to be united as a whole. I know a lot of people were jealous, and some of the ladies tried to have an affair with Frank. But he didn't want anyone but my daughter. Everything was so perfect, I never thought it would all come crashing down overnight because of a terrible tragedy. Barbara, of course, had to see a doctor. And Frank volunteered to pick up his sons from daycare. By a ridiculous coincidence, his car broke down that day, and he decided not to call a cab, but to take the children home through the park. The weather was beautiful, and although the rides were not yet open, there was a pizzeria at the exit of the park that the boys were eager to go to. Frank met a buddy on the way, and while he was talking to him, the kids scattered. They ran out onto the lake, but the marsh ice was treacherously thin. My grandchildren, as witnesses later told me, didn't even have time to scream. They went under in a flash. Frank and his buddy rushed to the pond. But no luck. Only the divers who arrived at the scene of the tragedy managed to catch the boys. Frank later tried to justify himself, like a clockwork, constantly repeating that he was distracted only for a few seconds. What's the use? Our boys had drowned. There was no fixing it. My son-in-law was the first to tell me this bitter news because he was afraid for Barbara, and for good reason. I went to the private clinic where I knew Barbara was at the time. My heart told me that it was better to have doctors close by when the worst of grief came upon my daughter. Seeing me in the hallway, Barbara must have realized everything by the look on my face. She was hysterical after hearing the news. Barbara could not be calmed down, even with a large dose of medication. She never went home that night. She ended up in the hospital with a nervous breakdown. My daughter was worried about her dead sons and was unable to save the baby that was developing under her heart. The doctors didn't even consider him a baby yet, and she had already lost him. At Adam and Henry's funeral, Barbara stood like a stone statue. No tears, no emotion. Pale as death. Especially frightening was the emptiness in her eyes. Frank was no less worried. In his 25 years, he tried to take Barbara's hand for support, but she shied away from him like a leper. She never again crossed the threshold of the apartment where she lived with her husband and sons. How many times Frank had tried to talk to her I couldn't count. Only it never worked. Barbara just cut her husband out of her life. Frank's mom came to us when she realized my daughter didn't want to see or hear from her husband. She was on her knees, begging me to forgive her son, saying he wasn't himself. I shared my sad thoughts that he was on the verge of leaving this world. But Barbara didn't react. She could never forgive her husband for the death of her sons. Frank could not forgive himself either. Indeed, he had turned from a blossoming man into a pale semblance of his former self. Barbara predictably quit her job, seemingly of her own accord. But in fact, everyone realized that she simply could not be under everyone's scrutiny. To make matters worse, an unusual and unexpected problem had arisen. The daughter was approaching hysterics. It was worth it to go outside and see the child. She would change her route, but it was impossible to absolutely eliminate the possibility of meeting children. One day, Barbara and I were riding in the elevator, and a neighbor with a baby came in with us. Everything seemed fine, but I wasn't too happy. After the neighbor got off the elevator, I looked at my daughter and saw that her chin was bleeding. So hard she bit her lip trying to hold back a tantrum. After this incident, my daughter stayed at home all day and night for almost a month. Even a special doctor, the best of the best, I called home. There were changes, but not quick and not at all positive. After a period of apathy, my daughter became aggressive. It was as if she had developed an obsession, and the medications prescribed by the doctor couldn't handle it for long. Barbara would take the pills for a few hours, become apathetic. Then she'd start thinking about something, pacing the room from side to side. Once I saw that she was looking for poison options on the net, and I was seriously frightened. I realized that my daughter had decided to deal with the unwitting perpetrator of her children's deaths. I tried to be there all the time, to keep an eye on my daughter, so she wouldn't do anything irreparable. One morning, Barbara managed to leave the house while I was asleep. People told me later that she caught up with Frank after his work and attacked him with her fists. She was yelling, "Why are you living here? Why don't our sons? I don't know, maybe my acquaintances exaggerated." But supposedly 4 strong men could barely pull her away from a distraught Frank. He didn't even fight back. When I came to pick her up, my daughter was sitting in the back room, where the aroma of the hated Corvalol and some other drugs was wafting. She was almost unresponsive to anything. I was told that an ambulance had come and sedated Barbara. Among acquaintances and neighbors, of course, there was only talk about the accident with my grandchildren, and that Barbara was going crazy with grief. One day, Frank's father called me and urged me to leave town with his daughter. You don't say no to people like him. Besides, I was thinking of ways to hide my daughter from memories, sympathetic and prying eyes. I quit my job, sold my apartment, again thanks to my son-in-law's parents. I managed to do it quickly, and at a price that was quite adequate, given the urgency. Barbara and Frank were divorced in absentia, again thanks to his relatives. My daughter didn't even have to go anywhere. We ended up moving to this town, away from everything. And then you know the rest, Matthew. You met her and my daughter started to come back to life. Don't think Barbara still hates it. She's just still in pain. She even refuses the opportunity to be a mom again for fear of repeating the nightmare she went through. Audrey was silent. Telling her daughter's terrible story, the woman was mentally exhausted. Matthew noticed how pale her face had become and hurried to the kitchen to fetch her some water. Roger was playing on his phone, and the man stroked his head, refilled his glass, and returned to Audrey in the hall. "Sorry, what made you remember everything?" he asked. The woman drank the water carefully and spoke bitterly. "Ah, Matthew, if only it could be forgotten. I probably should have told you about Barbara's past sooner. I've been hesitant to tell you. My daughter still can't talk about it either, I understand." The man looked at the woman, puzzled, and confessed. "To be honest, I had no idea that Barbara's reluctance to become a mom could hide such a tragedy. I thought she probably didn't want to ruin her figure. I can't even imagine how she felt when she saw Roger in our kitchen. What a surprise to surprise her on our anniversary. How am I supposed to apologize to Barbara and make her understand?" I really didn't have anywhere to bring Roger, the man continued. And the boy, for a number of reasons. I had to be sheltered for a week or two in a comfortable and safe place where his parents' enemies would have no reason to look. It all came about almost by accident. I arrived at the branch and ran into an old friend on the street whom I hadn't seen since my discharge. Hugh is more than a friend. He's the only reason I survived the army. But it's a long story. In the civilian life, we were separated by our hometowns, and as it happens, our contacts were lost. I tried to find him on social networks, but no luck. I guess I should have been more persistent. Then I would have found him, and then I got busy building my career. Anyway, I hadn't seen him in 15 years, and now I meet Hugh in a city that's foreign to both of us. I know he's changed over the years, but I recognized him immediately. He almost walked past me without noticing, but I stopped him. It turned out Hugh had come to solve his sister's and her husband's problems. They were embroiled in a lawsuit with some inadequate people who were used to dealing with things in a criminal way. Roger, of course, is just a perfect boy. He got to know his way around in a strange place. He even went to bed by himself, having brushed his teeth beforehand. Hugh was most worried about Roger, his nephew. He explained to his sister that the child should be hidden just in case, because through him the bandits could easily influence the decision of the issue in their favor. But they couldn't think of any safe place. And that's where I came in. To Hugh, the idea of taking Roger out of town seemed the ideal. Indeed, there were practically no clues that could put the bandits on the child's trail. It was a good thing that the boy had a strong character, a real man growing up. His parents and Hugh told him he had to stay with me for a while, and he took the news calmly. I picked him up like a detective, so as not to get caught on the city's CCTV cameras. We agreed to contact Hugh in a week, and he's supposed to call me when it's resolved. Roger and I are very easy to talk to, but I have to work on Monday, and I can hardly take him with me. I don't know what to do now, the man said. Matthew was silent. Suddenly, he and Audrey heard Barbara's voice. It's no big deal. You go to work as usual. I'll stay with Roger, only on the condition that the boy didn't have to take public transportation himself. It turned out that, contrary to Audrey's calculations, her daughter had already returned from the theater and seemed to have heard part of her husband's story. Preempting her mother's question, Barbara explained. I couldn't watch the play in the theater. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and realized that I couldn't go back and stare at the stage without even trying to understand the story. I texted Gabriella to apologize and came here. Turns out I got back just in time. I guess I should have heard Roger's story from the outside, because Matthew, I'm sorry I suspected you of cheating, and I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me all that yesterday. Today I can look at the situation more rationally. Mom, you don't mind if I visit with Roger, do you? Barbara asked. Audrey, trying not to frighten away the change in her daughter's attitude toward her children, spoke very carefully. Of course, come. Audrey wanted to say something else, but tears came to her eyes and she decided to change the subject. Barbara. Matthew, aren't you hungry? I could eat something right now. Let's go into the kitchen. All the more reason to see if Roger's having a good time. I've forgotten all about the rules of hospitality. When the boy saw Barbara, he remembered to say hello. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she responded to his greeting. Matthew, who had understood the reason for his wife's strange behavior, was now amazed at her resilience. She had been through such an ordeal and had never tried to appeal to his pity or to elicit sympathy by telling him what she had faced. Barbara gently but insistently dismissed Audrey's attempts to feed everyone gathered in her kitchen that evening. Thank you, Mom, for everything, but we should probably go home. I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon, she said. Matthew, realizing that he had received his wife's forgiveness, was very happy and bid Audrey a heartfelt farewell, promising, "We'll visit you all tomorrow. If you are feeling well and the weather is warm, we can go to the countryside. How would you like that, Audrey?" That's a wonderful idea, Matthew. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, the woman said. After saying goodbye to the hostess, Barbara, Matthew, and Roger drove to the other side of town. The man sat behind the wheel, and in the mirror he could see his wife carefully fastening the boy's seatbelt. It was obvious that for Barbara it was a completely natural gesture, brought once to automaticity. She was obviously a reverent, caring mother. She loved her children very much, and after the tragedy that had befallen her, she was suffering in a way that her worst enemy could not wish. Matthew carefully parked the car in the driveway. The man carried Roger, who had drowned, to the apartment. Barbara laid him on the couch, spreading the crumpled sheet, carefully removed the boy's shoes and covered him with a blanket. Watching his wife, Matthew felt incredible tenderness for her. Suddenly, the woman he loved opened up to him from an unfamiliar side of her personality, and he realized that he had made the absolutely right choice. Later, with the door to the kitchen closed, they drank tea with the remaining cake, and as if there had been no wall of misunderstanding between them yesterday. With jokes and kisses, they planned the schedule for Sunday afternoon. The man dared to bring up the unpleasant subject and confessed. "Barbara, I'm a real idiot. I almost ruined everything by my actions, and I want to say thank you very much for understanding." His wife smiled. "Well, to be honest, I overreacted too, so I suggest we forget it. Forget it." The weekend passed cheerfully, and even better than the spouses expected. They managed to get Audrey out for a walk, who was much less happy about the sunny May day than she was about her daughter's happy eyes. Barbara was happy to answer Roger's questions and to keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't in danger. Neither her mother nor her husband dared to reproach her for her hyper-opaque behavior. Roger did not seem to mind at all that he was surrounded by the utmost care. By agreement with Barbara, he called her by her first name without using the word aunt, and he seemed quite pleased with his unexpected journey. When they had brought Audrey home after the entertainment, the trio had to wait, for there was no chance of leaving the woman without being fed. No one minded, however. Late in the afternoon, as Barbara was putting Roger to bed, the boy asked her quietly, "Do you think my parents are doing well? Will I be able to see them soon?" Trying to keep her voice firm and convincing, Barbara replied, "Of course they are doing well. Very soon they will do all their business, and you will meet them." The reassured boy fell asleep. Barbara, fearful of waking the child, called her husband into the kitchen and began to question him about the story Roger's parents were involved in. "Barbara, I honestly don't even know all the details of that evening. My husband told me everything very briefly. But I realized that his sister and her husband were really attacked by some scumbags." The woman began to ask questions that surprised her husband. "These bandits are from the town you went to, or are they newcomers? Did they call each other anything? Did they have nicknames?" Matthew told everything he knew. But it was not enough for Barbara, and she suddenly asked, "Can't you get in touch with Hugh urgently? I need to get some clarifications from him to try to help Roger's parents. Of course, he's not bad and quite comfortable with us, I hope, but it shouldn't be that mother and son are separated for long." It was impossible to guess from Barbara's voice how closely she took Roger and his parents' situation to heart. But now, knowing about his wife's past, Matthew realized how difficult it was for her. "In fact, Hugh gave me a password to a chat room that automatically deletes all messages. I think we can try to contact him." The man opened the necessary site, entered the data that he had learned by heart at the request of his army friend, and after a few minutes he exclaimed with joy, "It worked. See, he welcomed me." Barbara thoughtfully advised, "Matthew, ask him a question that you can tell if he's talking to you. And if there's even the slightest doubt, close the site immediately and pull the SIM card out of the phone." Alarmed by his wife's suspicions, Matthew quickly typed a few phrases and waited impatiently for a reply. After reading the message he received, the man exhaled a sigh of relief. "It's okay. It's definitely Hugh. He answered with our code phrase." Barbara nodded and asked, "Okay, text Hugh that your wife will be texting him now. And give me the phone number. I'll find out everything I need to know from your friend." No longer surprised by anything, Matthew handed the smartphone to his wife. She texted with someone she didn't know for quite a while. Then she grabbed a pen, quickly wrote down a number on a bread wrapper, tore off a piece of paper with numbers on it, clutched it in her hand, and handed the phone to her husband. Barbara left the kitchen and headed for the bathroom, which had the best noise insulation in the apartment. After taking a few deep breaths, the woman dialed her former father-in-law's memorized number. But the phone was unavailable. Barbara gathered all her will and dialed her ex-husband's number. Soon his voice sounded in the receiver. "Hello. Don't be silent." "Frank, it's me, Barbara." Her voice trembled with excitement. Barbara, it's good to hear from you. The man's demanding tone softened considerably. My father is abroad, but if you tell me what the problem is, I'll do my best to help you. I am now working in the regional prosecutor's office, so all my connections are at your service. Thank you, the woman replied and told me everything she had learned, dictating the number she had written down. Okay, Barbara, I get it. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's manageable. I think in the end, for every scumbag, there's a more powerful force. I'll try to help and warn this acquaintance that I'll call him tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, depending on how things turn out. He'll be able to take the call from his cell phone. Thank you, Frank. Without waiting for her ex-husband's retort, Barbara ended the conversation and washed her face with ice water, hoping that it would bring her at least a semblance of composure. During her conversation with Frank, she wanted to apologize to him, but she couldn't. The bitter resentment of his neglect, which had caused her to lose her children, still burned her heart. At the same time, Barbara was well aware that without the intervention of her ex-husband, who had extensive connections in the area, Roger's family was practically doomed. And she wanted to keep the boy safe and try to save his parents. For a while, Barbara sat in the bathroom, equalizing her breathing with exercises. Seeing that an hour had practically passed, she returned to Matthew in the kitchen and informed him of what Frank had said. The man texted his friend the information he had received from his wife and hugged Barbara tightly. He saw how exhausted the woman he loved had become in the last hour and didn't know how to help her. He wanted to protect her from all adversity. Instead, Barbara had to turn, as Matthew easily guessed, to the man who had nearly destroyed her destiny to the ground. The conversation stirred the woman. She released herself from Matthew's embrace and automatically began clearing the table, not paying attention to the fact that she was sending her husband's completely untouched food into the trash. Finally, the man intercepted her hand and suggested, "Drop the fuss. It's been a hard day and we need to rest." Even as she listened to the peaceful breathing of her sleeping husband, Barbara could not calm down. The images of her little ones came to her mind's eye. They smiled toothless smiles at her. Then they were going to kindergarten for the first time and turning to the window, waving their little hands at her. They give her Mother's Day cards. Here, obviously conspiring, instead of falling asleep, they clap loudly and unanimously when she starts to sing them a lullaby. How many pleasant moments there were, so carefully stored somewhere far away in the memory. And so rudely all had been crossed out by an accident. How many times she had warned her sons not to take risks. And they still wouldn't listen. But what was the use of being angry now? You can't get the water back. Their father is now the only hope that Roger will soon be able to hug his mother. At least let Frank be able to help this complete stranger to Barbara. "Bab, bab, bab," Roger mumbled, and Barbara slipped out from under her husband's arm and hurried to the boy. Carefully she adjusted the blanket, which he had almost thrown to the floor. Felt Roger's forehead, frightened that the child had spiked a fever, and breathing a sigh of relief, sensing that, from her experience, all was well. Roger opened his eyes and Barbara sat down on the edge of the couch and hummed softly a lullaby. The boy had long since fallen asleep, but the woman remained seated beside him. She wanted the child to return to his parents as soon as possible, and at the same time she realized that she would desperately miss spending time with him. As the sky, visible through the slit between the curtains, lightened, Barbara went quietly to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and work on her papers, because there was no point in going to bed. In these lucid hours, maybe somewhere far away, were already deciding issues directly related to the fate of Roger. But Barbara was powerless to influence anything. She had already done all that she could, overcoming her resentment. And now all that remained was to wait for the result. After carefully studying the papers, the woman made notes in the margins, wrote out her suggestions on a separate sheet of paper, and carefully tucking everything away in a zippered folder, began, trying not to make any noise, to prepare breakfast. She had already decided to ask Audrey's boss to excuse her, so as not to tire the boy out too much by moving around unfamiliar places. After waiting for the time to send messages, Barbara typed to Audrey that she would send the prepared documents through her husband. She began to think about what she could do to please the little guest, who of course was worried about being separated from his parents, although he was trying to be a good boy. When Matthew, who had showered but was still yawning, came into the kitchen, Barbara had almost everything ready. She invited her husband to the table and asked, "Matthew, stop by on your way to Jack's and give him the file for me." I've already warned him that I won't be able to stop by work for a few days. And if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, have him email it to me or have it forwarded through you. As a last resort, of course, I'll come over. But I don't want to stress Roger out. I was going to take him to Audrey's mom's and then go to the Children's Entertainment Center. Why does he have to play on the computer all the time? Let him have fun. Let him have fun. Let him have fun. Let him have fun. Keep his mind off the sad stuff. He was having nightmares at night. Matthew agreed to his wife's plan, and after quickly swallowing his breakfast, he thanked her and began to get ready for work. Roger woke up much later, but Barbara didn't think to wake him up. She wanted the boy to feel no discomfort. The woman fed the child and then suggested, "Let's stop by my mom's for a while and then we'll go somewhere to rest." Barbara received a text message on her phone, and she smiled when she saw the notification that the money had been deposited. Matthew made sure his wife didn't have any financial problems. The woman smiled and asked the boy, "Would you like me and you to go to an amusement park? It's not far from the city, and there are many different options for a fun vacation, a laughing room, rope courses, and I think even a climbing wall. Do you like that kind of active entertainment? Or maybe you prefer a movie? That's no problem either. I haven't seen a movie on the big screen in a long time." Roger confessed embarrassedly, "I'd rather go to an amusement park, to be honest. So that's where we'll head." Audrey was delighted when her daughter came to see her with the boy. It meant that Barbara believed her husband and didn't go out of her way to demand that the child be placed somewhere because of her traumas and memories. She could see that Barbara seemed desperate even after her brief interaction with Roger and barely got them to leave as soon as possible. "Daughter, I feel just fine today. Go have fun. I'll call you if there's anything, of course. In fact, don't worry about it. Really, I have more energy today after yesterday's walk." Audrey turned to the boy and asked Roger, "I beg you, rest well for you and for me." The boy nodded gravely and promised, "I'll have Barbara take pictures and send them to you. You have an advanced smartphone, don't you?" The woman smiled and praised. "Well done. That's a great idea. I'm sure I'll have fun with you." Barbara checked. "Do you have a charged cell phone?" Barbara reassured her mother, saying she could recharge her phone in the car at any time. Soon the guests left Audrey, and she, left alone, began to dream that her daughter would finally decide to be a mom again. It was obvious to the woman that Barbara could perfectly find a common language with children. She had suffered for so many years, purposely avoiding contact with them. "Let everything turn out well for the injured girl," Audrey pleaded, hoping aloud that the plea would be heard somewhere upstairs. Barbara, driving with particular care, was taking Roger for fun and felt the weight of the responsibility she had voluntarily taken on. The boy had first of all asked to go on the rope course, and the woman had agreed. She wanted to grab the child in her arms and hold him in her arms. Barbara watched the boy and took photos from time to time, but she didn't dare to distract herself from sending especially expressive pictures to her mother. It seemed to the woman that if she took her eyes off the boy for even a few seconds, something bad would happen. The thought crossed her mind of the degree of desperation Roger's mom was in if she agreed to give her son to a near stranger. Such an act could only be dared because of the real threat to the child's life and health. So she, Barbara, had no right to let down a woman about whom she knew the bare minimum of information: name, surname, age, and the fact that the unfortunate woman, together with her husband, had gotten involved in a story from which she could not get out on her own. Barbara, however, was in an even more advantageous position. Erin, Roger's mother, knew even less about the people who had taken her son in. The fun-filled Monday had flashed by without a second thought. The boy, tired from his many outdoor activities, fell asleep after a hearty dinner and rested peacefully until morning without crying out or waking up. Matthew and Barbara chatted quietly in the kitchen. The woman spoke enthusiastically about how bravely Roger had conquered the rides and showed pictures. "Tomorrow I want to take our guest to our museums after his visit to his mother, and then go to the movies. Or vice versa, whichever Roger wants. If you can join us, it'll be fun. He's so funny, and sometimes he has such deep thoughts. He told me today that adults try to look serious on purpose so that they'll be afraid and no one will bother them. Can you believe that?" The man agreed that there was something reasonable in that conclusion. "And I suggest, Barbara, let's go to bed like Roger. because tomorrow I expect it's going to be just as busy." Neither Tuesday nor Wednesday brought word from Frank or the boy's relatives. Although the child attended all sorts of entertaining and educational establishments, his mood grew worse every day. He became more and more reflective and sad. Matthew and Barbara realized that the boy was missing his family more and more, but they could not influence the situation. Only on Thursday, when Barbara and Roger were visiting Audrey, the long-awaited call came. Frank informed his ex-wife that the main difficulties were over and warned, "There are still a few things to be resolved, but that's minor. The main thing is that the boy is no longer in danger. His parents have already left in the direction of the city where you now live. I warned them to call you in advance, as they will arrive, and clarify the address. Anyway, I'll take this case to the final point, of course. Don't worry." Barbara thanked her ex-husband profusely. "Thank you, Frank, and forgive me for everything." The man's voice was ringing as he replied to the woman he had hurt so much. "Barbara, you don't know how glad I am to hear from you, even if it's for such an occasion. I wish you happiness, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll always be glad to help you." Barbara said goodbye to her ex-husband. Audrey, hearing her daughter's conversation, couldn't believe her own ears. It seems that her Barbara quite adequately just communicated with a man whom she had once loved and then hated. "Mom, we have to leave. Roger's parents are already on the road, and I still need to give him a bath." The child realized that he would soon see his mom and dad and started jumping around the room, shouting yay. Barbara barely managed to keep him quiet. Audrey, happy that the situation had been resolved safely, gave the boy a souvenir of her photograph and a collection of stamps, which he liked so much. "Here you go, Roger. You'll look at the album and remember." "I won't forget me, Grandma Audrey," even without stamps, the child promised. Seizing the moment, Barbara called her husband to tell him the good news, but it turned out he already knew. "Barbara, Hugh told me that your help has solved everything. I'm taking a cab home now to get ready for the party." Barbara was a little sad to part with the boy who had awakened in her memories of the most joyous days with her sons, and she invited him to visit the toy store on the way. "You know, I'd really like to get you something too. Choose whatever you want." The boy did not resist, but apparently embarrassed, did not walk for a long time between the racks with toys on display, and very soon he took from the shelf not the most expensive robot. On the way to the checkout, Barbara put in the basket an airplane, which Roger had once told her admiringly, and some more board games. "Oh, so many things," marveled the child. "What a celebration today." "Yes, Roger, it's a very big party today," Barbara agreed. By the time the doorbell rang, the boy was already cleanly ransomed and the cutlery was flaunting on the table. Erin, barely over the threshold, rushed to her son, hugging him and showering him with kisses. The boy's father handed Barbara flowers, and Hugh gave Matthew a firm, manly hug. After Roger, assuming the role of an adult, introduced the parents to the owners of the apartment, everyone sat down to eat. Erin volunteered to help Barbara and confessed, "If it weren't for your kindness, I don't know how we would have gotten through this. I don't know how to express my gratitude. My husband and I have raised money to offset the cost of Roger and your inconvenience." Barbara turned pale and replied, "Erin, put that envelope away at once. Don't insult me with this act. You have a boy who will be going to school soon, so spend this money on him. If it's not too much trouble, send me and my husband a picture of him once in a while. That would be the best, thanks." Outraged, Erin burst into tears and hugged Barbara. When Roger, disturbed by his mother and Barbara's long absence from the table, looked into the kitchen, he saw the women roaring, unable to hold back their tears, and began to ask in a mature manner, "What happened? Did you get bumped, cut, burned?" Barbara and Erin wiped away their tears synchronously. "It's okay, sweetie, and everything is just fine," the mom reassured her son. Putting her arms around the boy, she picked him up, lifted him up, and surrounded him. Barbara watched the happy people and did not feel envy, but wished that this family had all the turmoil in the past. After the guests had departed, Barbara trustingly snuggled up to her husband and confided to him, "You know, I think I'm ready for motherhood. Roger proved to me that children are the greatest happiness." The man did not change his wife's mind. Soon Barbara pleased him and Audrey with the news of her pregnancy. Exactly on time and without any complications, the woman gave birth to a daughter. The girl was named Sharon in honor of Matthew's army friend, and as a symbol of victory over the terrible memories of the past.